The phrase, "the first casualty of war is truth," is a phrase that's been said so much that it feels tired, generic, or just overused. But the funny thing is, for once, this is one bit of repetition that actually does deserve to be heard. It's said so often because, really, it's true. Propaganda is always a part of our daily lives, whether we notice it or not, because politics is ever present, and so are politicians. There's always a leader who needs to justify themselves, to get you on their side, or if they can't manage that, to stop you caring about their actions. And if that leader is prosecuting a war, well, the consequences of the public paying attention and going against them can be dire. Trials, revolutions, a ticket to the grave. The choices are endless. And so, to counteract this, we face a barrage of misinformation and disinformation, day in, day out, from a huge range of sources, designed to mould our view or tune us out, distorting and repackaging as much as possible to avoid scrutiny, making a circus of world events and turning the dying and the suffering into faraway figures, too distant to be victims. In the last few decades, this has only increased. The great innovation of the internet means that we have interconnectivity our ancestors could never have even dreamed of, but that connectivity has detriments alongside its benefits. The reach of the honest, the integral, the genuine has extended, but so has the reach of the liars, the snake oil salesmen, the mental gymnasts, and the bullshit artists. And that's a risk everyone has to be aware of. Another often overused, sadly true point is to say that the time needed to combat misinformation is far greater than the time needed to spread it. And in some ways, it's guaranteed to be a losing battle, as some people just don't want to be reached. Nowadays, we can be assaulted by unrelenting waves of disingenuous narratives, especially during times of war. No matter what faction you might align your views with, it can be difficult to stay aware of the plot holes and incongruencies in a story, and there is a real danger of becoming complacent. Complacency is our enemy, and we hope you will keep us and yourself accountable. Welcome to Mega. No. Okay, we probably should tackle this topic with a little more depth than that. Shortly after the invasion of Ukraine began, some commentators sympathetic to the pro-Russian side of the war began arguing that Russia's intervention in Ukraine was justified under international law. Take for example this video by a commentator called Richard Medhurst, which features an interview with US war veteran and commentator Scott Ritter.
Because the rest of the world, or let's say the Western world, says Russia's violating international law. Is it really? Like, if it's invoking Article 51?
Well, let's just start with the basics. The greatest war crime of all is the illegal war of aggression. That's not me saying that. That's the Nuremberg military tribunal after the Second World War condemning Germans to die for the crime of promoting illegal war of aggression. And from this came the United Nations Charter, which sought to ban conflict. That's one of the, you're not allowed to go to war. Yep. But they recognize humans being humans, that we're going to go to war. Now we come to Article 51. Article 51 is self-defense. And this is the one that basically says that if you're attacked, you have a right to defend yourself. It also talks about collective self-defense. So if you're attacked, people are allowed to come to your assistance, to assist you. But it's predicated on the notion that you have been attacked. How did Russia justify Article 51? Well, the first thing they did is they talked about the notion of collective defense. And what they mean by that is that they are aligned with the newly independent republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. Because without that, people will say, well, wait a minute, Lugansk and Donetsk, even under Russia's geopolitical analysis, are part of Ukraine. So how can Russia come to the defense of Ukraine to protect it from Ukraine? Article 51 would fail there. Mm-hmm. But now that these are independent nations, Russia can articulate that claim. But people will then say, but wait a minute, Lugansk and Donetsk, they're not United Nations members. So how can they suddenly talk about United Nations rights, but they're not United Nations members? Now we come to collective defense. And fortunately for Russia, NATO has provided a wonderful case study. Because in 1999, NATO attacked Serbia, citing Article 51. Now, NATO is not a member of the United Nations. How can they do that? Under the notion of collective defense, that NATO assumed the character of a mutual defense alliance arrangement. And therefore, that collective can speak of preemptively attacking to defend the collective against an imminent threat. The imminent threat, of course, being Serbia. Now, NATO hyped up the threat, called it genocide when it wasn't genocide, but that's a different issue. The bottom line, though, is that NATO justified their actions against Serbia under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, using collective defense in a non-UN member state association. So Russia comes in and says, we are now affiliated with Lugansk and Donetsk in a collective defense matter, and we are coming to their defense over Ukrainian attacks that have been taking place for the past 8 years in the Donbass. But now you'll even say, well, okay, even if we buy into this, Ritter, and you have to because that's sort of the law, that doesn't justify them going against Ukraine. It justifies them defending Lugansk and Donetsk, a limited military operation. Now we come to the other thing. Russia says, yes, but Ukraine has been massing their forces opposite Donetsk and opposite the Donbass, 100 to 120,000 of their best troops. And they were preparing an attack on the Donbass to recapture it. And therefore, we had to preempt that attack with a larger military incursion, a special military operation. And when we decided to expand that, we had no choice then but to take into the totality of Ukraine, because if we simply fight a battle against the 120,000 troops, that frees up Ukraine to bring the rest of their military down on us, and that would create a disadvantage for us.
So Ritter's legal argument says that the UN Charter allows for collective self-defense. His idea that Russia's military can legally go to war for this reason comes from a previous example of collective self-defense that he brings up: the bombing of a country called Yugoslavia by NATO in 1999. Yugoslavia was a union made up of several European groups of people that existed in various forms from 1918 to 2006. You may remember it from one of our world maps in the first chapter, showing the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. In the 1990s, Yugoslavia was crumbling, just like the Soviet Union, but in a much slower, more brutal way. This was a process that took a whole decade, not just a year or two, and involved half a dozen conflicts, much like its Austro-Hungarian predecessor. Yugoslavia ended up being divided along ethnic lines. Eventually, only 2 of the country's 6 member states remained: Serbia and Montenegro. Serbia was the biggest of these, which is why Ritter called Yugoslavia Serbia. In 1996, a province of Serbia, Kosovo, faced a rebellion from a group called the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was made up of ethnic Albanians who wanted the majority Albanian region of Kosovo to secede from Serbia and Yugoslavia. Despite initially calling the KLA terrorists, the US government later offered their support to the KLA. and in 1999, they organised a NATO intervention into the conflict, subjecting Yugoslavia to a massive bombing campaign. After 78 days of bombings, the Yugoslav government agreed to leave Kosovo and allow a NATO military group called the Kosovo Force to take over. Kosovo later formally declared independence from Serbia and became its own state in 2008, with many ex-KLA figures forming the new Kosovan government. The International Court of Justice, a body of the UN, supported Kosovo's independence in a ruling in 2010 by claiming that Kosovan independence didn't violate international law. In short, Ritter's argument is that because NATO used principles of self-defense to go to war with Yugoslavia and support the Kosovan separatists, Russia has the right to use these principles to go to war with Ukraine and support the separatists in the Donbass region. This rhetoric is an old trick as well. Russia used it to justify their support for the separatists in Moldova and Georgia as well back in the late 2000s, claiming that if Kosovo could be a country, these separatists could be too. The playbook is much older than people realise. The problem with this line of thinking is, even if we were to say that this precedent does exist in some form, it's not universal by any means. When Kosovo declared independence in 2008, the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, was interviewed by a Russian news agency called Interfax, and he stated that Kosovo was a special case, not a trendsetter. It's entirely up to governments to decide which foreign countries they recognise and which they don't, not any other institutions like the UN. As for that ICJ ruling by the UN supporting Kosovo independence, well, it's non-binding. It's not an actual legal thing that world governments have to accept, and many countries don't support Kosovan independence. UN member states are essentially split 50-50 when it comes to Kosovo, and one of the countries that doesn't recognise Kosovo actually is Russia. Russia's government opposed the bombing of Yugoslavia in the 90s, kicked out the NATO representative to Russia in response to it, and later supported Serbia in its rejection of the Kosovan separatists by refusing to recognise Kosovo's independence and even encouraging NATO to adopt what they called severe administrative measures against the Kosovan government, claiming Kosovo as an integral part of Serbia. In fact, Russia's rejection of NATO support for Kosovo was so strong that it almost led to a war between Russian and NATO troops, a war that was only stopped because British troops refused to obey orders from a US general to attack Russian soldiers. So the legal argument in defence of the Russian invasion here is based on a principle that the Russian government has strongly, consistently rejected repeatedly for over 20 years. NATO's actions in the 90s definitely didn't create any sort of universal precedent that Russia can rely on today. All that Ritter is doing here is pointing out the hypocrisy of Western countries, which is fair, as Western nations have invaded and bombed foreign countries that weren't attacking them before, just as Russia has attacked Ukraine.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway.
And when you look at what NATO did in Kosovo and compare it to Russian actions in Donbass, there are similarities. But aggression from one country doesn't magically justify aggression from another. Yes, Western countries may have plenty of skeletons in their closet, even more than Russia has. But supporters of Russia aren't doing themselves any favours by resorting to whataboutism. Whataboutism is great for calling out someone's double standards, but not for defending their actions. After all, if Russia is trying to create an anti-Western or anti-NATO alliance and challenge countries like the US for control over the world, shouldn't they be behaving better and more principled than their rivals, rather than becoming just as dirty? The next argument Scott Ritter brings up in his legal defense of the Russian government is this.
The other thing that Russia used as an issue of preemption was Zelensky's misguided statements to the Munich Security Council, where he said, we need to get out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and we need to acquire nuclear weapons.
Basically.
And Russia went, we have intelligence that you may in fact be trying to do that. So they added a WMD clause to their justification, and they moved in. I don't know what the viability of their intelligence is, but what I can say is, in Chernobyl and in the other nuclear power plant that they took control of down south, there are giant pools of water that contain spent uranium fuel rods. These are highly radioactive waste that could be ground up, mixed with high explosives to create a dirty bomb.
Right.
And the Russians claim to have intelligence that the Ukrainians were at least considering doing this. They also had intelligence that said that in these depleted uranium fuel rods, or the spent fuel rods, 10% of their weight is actually plutonium-239, which is used for nuclear weapons. And that if the Ukrainians wanted to extract the plutonium-239, they could then have the fissile core necessary to produce a nuclear weapon. So therefore, we need to gain control over these ponds to make sure that this isn't happening. And there was an imminent need, citing Zelensky's own statement at the Munich Security Conference. So that's
Rissa claims that Ukraine's President Zelensky talked about Ukraine building nuclear weapons at the Munich Security Conference, and mentions that Ukraine has the material to build these weapons because of fuel rods at Ukrainian nuclear plants, justifying Russia's war as a way of preventing Ukraine from making nuclear weapons and using them on Russian soil. The small problem with this claim is that we can easily scrutinise it, because a transcript of Zelensky's speech at that event is publicly available. In the transcript of the speech, the word nuclear is only mentioned once, in this context.
I want to believe that the North Atlantic Treaty and Article 5 will be more effective than the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine has received security guarantees for abandoning the world's third nuclear capability. We don't have that weapon. We also have no security. We also do not have part of the territory of our state that is larger in area than Switzerland, the Netherlands, or Belgium. And most importantly, we don't have millions of our citizens. We don't have all this. Therefore, we have something. The right demand a shift from a policy of appeasement to ensuring security and peace guarantees. Since 2014, Ukraine has tried 3 times to convene consultations with the guarantor states of the Budapest Memorandum, 3 times without success. Today, Ukraine will do it for the 4th time. I, as president, will do this for the 1st time. But both Ukraine and I are doing this for the last time. I am initiating consultations in the framework of the Budapest Memorandum. The Minister of Foreign Affairs was commissioned to convene them. If they do not happen again, or their results do not guarantee security for our country, Ukraine will have every right to believe that the Budapest Memorandum is not working and all the package decisions of 1994 are in doubt.
What Rissa claimed Zelensky's speech said was that
we need to get out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and we need to acquire nuclear weapons.
However, looking at the speech, we can see that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, is not mentioned at all. What Zelensky does talk about is the Budapest Memorandum. You see, when Ukraine became an independent country as the Soviet Union ceased to exist, it inherited a portion of the Soviet Union's stash of over 40,000 nuclear weapons, leaving it with an arsenal of about 1,700 nukes, one of the biggest stockpiles in the world. But shortly after becoming independent, Ukraine gave up this arsenal and joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which banned it from building a nuclear arsenal or trying to acquire one. To support this, the Ukrainians signed up to the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, along with Russia, the USA, and UK. This memorandum was an agreement between these countries to do 6 things. 1. Respect Ukraine's independence and existing borders. 2. Refrain from threatening force or using force against Ukraine, except in self-defense. 3. refrain from economic coercion that would subordinate Ukraine to another country or threaten Ukraine's independence. 4. Agree to provide assistance to Ukraine if Ukraine is attacked with nuclear weapons or threatened with an attack by nuclear weapons. 5. Agree to not use nuclear weapons against any country that is part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, including Ukraine, unless they are attacked by a nuclear weapons state, or a country allied to a nuclear weapons state. And 6. Consult if a situation arises which calls into question the previous commitments. These were guarantees that Ukraine received in exchange for giving up its nuclear arsenal and joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What Zelensky said in his speech is that this agreement wasn't working, and that if it continued to fail to provide security to Ukraine, it would become a worthless scrap of paper. Considering that Russia has broken every single point of this agreement except the fifth one, what he was saying wasn't just an opinion, it was a statement of fact. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for receiving guarantees, and these guarantees turned out to be empty promises. Ukraine, by the way, has remained a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty ever since it joined in 1994. As for Ritter's point about material in Ukrainian plants being something that the Ukrainians could pack along with explosives to build a dirty bomb, a kind of radioactive weapon, any nuclear plant in any country will obviously contain radioactive material, and some of that could theoretically go towards building radioactive military weapons. Over 30 countries in the world have nuclear power plants. If having nuclear material alone justifies war, Russia should invade all of these countries so that they can't become a threat. That would be more fair, wouldn't it? As we can see, the more we try to follow this logic to its conclusion, the more insane it becomes. But that's the thing. Once again, this isn't a serious legal argument, and it isn't really meant to make sense, which is why the person making it and his host burst out laughing while talking about it.
They added a WMD clause to their justification.
This once again is just pointing out another hypocrisy. The USA invaded Iraq on the basis of non-existent weapons of mass destruction, along a barrage of other dubious claims. So if Russia does the same thing to Ukraine, it's only fair. The US government are a bunch of hypocrites for complaining about it. And again, yes, the US are hypocrites about this issue. But again, no, this doesn't make Russia any more justified or legitimate in their actions. Besides, when you're a small country threatened by a superpower next door, wanting to have nuclear weapons isn't some kind of evil or great shame, a topic we discussed at length in our documentary on North Korea. So even if the Ukrainians were guilty of this point Ritter levels at them, it wouldn't make it any more justifiable for Russia to invade them.
Added to this, and I think combined, we see that Russia has articulated a cognizable case invalid. It turns out that the Russians actually have a pretty sound case derived by fact.
Not really. In conclusion, fuck off, Ritter. With Russia's annexations of the 4 eastern regions of Ukraine, the old argument about collective self-defense became out of date. The new argument was that these regions are part of Russia, and that Ukraine trying to retake them is an attack on Russia's territory. And if we were to accept the referendums that led to these annexations, that would be perfectly true. These regions would be Russian, and Russia would only be acting in rational self-defense. After all, if there's a foreign army occupying your land, it's only right to kick them out, isn't it? That means we have to talk about these referendums. Obviously, it goes without saying that they weren't legal under Ukrainian law, but many countries don't gain their independence legally. Independence is something you usually have to fight for in one way or another. So the important question is, do these referendums reflect what the people of their regions wanted? If we take their results at face value, Russia had an overwhelming mandate to annex the regions, as the great majority of people wanted it to happen. But that's a big if. The main issue with these referendums is that only one of the 5 days they ran for involved in-person voting at polling stations, like a normal referendum. You might think that this isn't necessarily a problem, and it isn't. There are other ways to vote in an election. Some people prefer to vote by mail. Some countries even allow for online voting in some circumstances. But for 4 out of 5 days of the referendum, the voting looked more like this. Rather than people going out to vote or mailing their vote in, pro-Russian officials went to local communities door to door, accompanied by soldiers or police, with the ballots. According to some reports, these officials didn't even hand the ballots out to the voters. Instead, they would have people vote verbally and mark the papers for them. With this in mind, we can start to understand the stunning result of over 99% in favour of joining Russia at their highest and 78% at their lowest, with turnouts of over 75% in all regions. When the ballot comes to you, rather than you going to it, it's hard not to turn out. And when you're thinking of how to vote, your ballot being collected by officials, accompanied by soldiers and police, who you know all favour one side in the referendum, could be a deciding factor, to put it mildly. This is already enough to make these referendums suspect, but we also have to remember that portions of the regions being balloted weren't even under Russian or separatist control. In fact, in Zaporizhia region, the namesake and capital of the region, Zaporizhia city, was under Ukrainian control during the referendum. So given that these regions were annexed through referendums where half the population didn't vote, and the other half voted under the watchful eye of occupying soldiers and police, it's safe to say that you would have to be an expert athlete in mental gymnastics to believe this could be taken as a real expression of a population's will. Of course, in spite of all this, the gymnasts are out there, going out to argue for these factors as necessary for security reasons. But I would suggest that if you need to make all of these compromises just to run a vote, your vote doesn't have much value to begin with. We got what can only be described as an electoral comedy act. And internationally, these referendums were not taken seriously either, with the UN Security Council voting to condemn Russia's annexations in a resolution that only one country voted against: Russia itself. The rest of the UN followed suit a week later by voting on the same resolution. 143 countries supporting it, 5 against, 35 abstentions. No. Alright, I probably shouldn't pull that trick on you a second time. Let's look at this seriously. Ever since Vladimir Putin rose to power, many people have tried to understand his motives, his worldview, what makes him tick. And as Russia is dominating the headlines thanks to the war he's perpetuating, that speculation has only increased. Since the last time Russia was a boogeyman in the eyes of the Western world, it was the communist-led Soviet Union. A lot of amateur politicians and commentators out there seem to think what we're witnessing is a repeat. There's this emerging concept that Putin is a sort of communist who wants to remake the Soviet Union. Ironically, even some communists have come to believe this on some level, portraying modern-day Russia and the pro-Russian separatists as some sort of socialist cause. And it's true that on some level, Putin is nostalgic for the Soviet days. But here's the thing. It's not because of a commitment to communism. This is something different. It's about nationalism and power. The USSR had half the world under its sway, a sphere of influence that started in Moscow and spread all the way to Berlin, Brazzaville, Hanoi, Havana. There was no continent that the USSR didn't touch. When the USSR collapsed, that influence collapsed with it, and its mortal enemy, the USA, took its place. And we saw in the previous chapters that meant Russia watched as its former allies were wiped off the map. This is an experience of humiliation that Putin wants to undo. He wants to rebuild Russia's reach again and block out its rivals. That's a lot of what the war in Ukraine is about. For the same reasons, you could also say he's nostalgic for the Russian Empire, which was even larger than the Soviet Union was. And even when showing some signs of Soviet nostalgia, he criticised the communists for killing the empire's monarch, the Tsar, and for opposing Russia's rich figures and religious leaders. Really, Putin and his ruling party don't have much of a platform beyond Russian nationalism, and that's why his rhetoric often confuses outside observers. You see, both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union were times of strength and influence for Russia, so despite their obvious ideological differences, they are both looked back on with a strong dose of nostalgia by Russian nationalists. That's how Putin has attracted followers from both conservative and progressive forces. He panders to this romantic nostalgia. But when it comes to practice rather than theory, Putin's party, United Russia, has been described as either right-wing or centrist over the years, but not left-wing, let alone communist. And just to hammer home how Putin really feels about the communists, he actually assigned a lot of the guilt for the current conflict in Ukraine to them, blaming them for, in his words, creating Ukraine, something that made Russia's actual communists rather unhappy.
Время исключительно ответственное. Оно требует максимальной сплоченности. Но не может быть сплоченности, когда из Кремля раздаются голоса, от которых и не веет исторической правдой. Кто не понимает суть ленинско-сталинской модернизации, тот не сумеет возродить страну.
In case you watched our episode 1 history segment, you may remember that the communist leader here is right. Putin is being historically inaccurate. The modern Ukrainian state was not created by the Soviets, because the first modern Ukrainian state was the Ukrainian People's Republic, which fought against the Soviets during the Russian Civil War. So Putin in fact blames the communists for things they didn't even do. And this is another very common trick that Putin and his supporters love to play in the propaganda war over Ukraine, claiming that Ukraine only is what it is today thanks to ever so benevolent Russian leaders, and that the Russian leaders of today have a right to revoke these Russian gifts as they please. Maps like this have become a common prop of pro-Russia commentators, think tanks, and even just bystanders who probably don't know any better. They're often used to argue for Ukraine's dismemberment, but on a closer examination, you can see that they're, to put it generously, economical with the truth. To put it less generously, they're complete bullshit. Once again, we can turn to the first chapter of this series to examine the claims presented by these maps. Right off the bat, we can see an obvious lie. The Russian Tsars never gifted even an inch of land to Ukraine, because under the Tsarist era, they didn't even recognise Ukraine's existence. In this era, Ukraine was known by other names, like Malorussia, Little Russia, or Novorossia, New Russia, the same name pro-Russian separatists use today. To Russia's rulers, Ukraine was just another part of Russia, so rather than gifting land to Ukraine, they were gifting land to themselves. Doesn't sound so generous when you put it that way, does it? And as for the rest, everything on this map except Crimea was part of the territory of the Ukrainian and West Ukrainian People's Republics, declared by the Ukrainians themselves in the aftermath of World War I. The Soviet Union simply recognised the same claims when they formed their own rival Ukrainian government, and put them to practice in the aftermath of World War II. And why were these territories included in Ukraine? It's pretty simple. Because Ukrainians lived there. As for Crimea, the transfer of Crimea from Russia to Ukraine was encouraged by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, a Russian born near the Ukrainian border, but the decision was ultimately signed off by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, whose chairman was Kliment Voroshilov. Guess where he was from? Bakhmut, Ukraine. So to put it simply, Ukrainians have next to nothing to thank Russia for when it comes to territory. They had to fight for recognition, and they had to fight for longer than other nations that emerged from the corpse of the Russian Empire. The only people who have a right to decide what land is Ukrainian and what land is Russian are the people who live on that land, not politicians in Moscow or anywhere else. And if the Russian think tanks want to look to the 1600s to decide what nations should look like today, I would say be careful what you wish for, because Russia was a lot smaller back then too. Alongside historical myths, Russian leaders also love to refer to more recent grievances to try and justify their actions. Specifically, Ukraine's constitutional crisis in 2014, when Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was illegally ousted and replaced by a so-called interim government consisting of his opponents. Despite the fact that the so-called interim government didn't last long and was followed by successive elected governments, in the propaganda line of Russia, these governments are still illegitimate, tainted by the 2014 coup and still suffering a legitimacy crisis, with Russian officials and aggregators referring to the Ukrainian government as the Kiev Regime. And there is, in a way, some weight to this idea. It's a simple matter of fact that whatever you think about Yanukovych, he wasn't removed from power legally. So how legitimate are the elections that followed his removal, if they were organised by authorities that had no mandate? This is a genuine question that can be asked. But the irony in this topic is that it can be applied to Russia as well. As mentioned in the second episode of this series, the current Russian constitution, established in 1993, didn't come into force by legal or democratic means. It came about through a coup, where Boris Yeltsin illegally abolished the Russian parliament and constitution, then formed a new one to push through the reforms he wanted. In order to do this, he used military force against the parliamentarians that opposed him. Despite having no right to do as he pleased, Yeltsin made sure to take what he wanted with might, with Russia later inheriting a system that was born through crime. Putin took notes, having been Yeltsin's vice president and his successor to the presidency. If we follow the logic of the Russian authorities consistently, they are tainted by a legitimacy crisis, and have no right to complain if separatists emerge and try to secede. If Ukraine needs a denazification, perhaps Russia needs a de-Yeltsification. So how do we answer this legitimacy question? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. Almost no constitution or legal system has legally replaced its predecessor. The Russian Federation didn't legally replace the Russian Soviet. The Russian Soviets didn't legally replace its predecessor, the Russian Empire, either. This doesn't taint the legitimacy of these states, because the legitimacy of laws and constitutions are defined from only one source: the populations they represent. Because there's no other source we can really look to. It used to be religion. Governments originally claimed their right to power from the will of God. This idea was called the divine right of kings. But with the advent of more religiously diverse and secular societies, this idea has gone out of fashion. So we only really have two alternatives: circular logic, the law is the law because it's the law, or popular consent, the law is the law because people accept the rule of law. Only one of these alternatives makes any sense. So what differentiates an illegitimate authority from a legitimate one is the will of the people. The Ukrainian people accept Zelensky's right to be their president, so he has the right to be their president. That's all there is to it. There is no legitimacy crisis, no Kiev regime, just a government, the Ukrainian government, which has as much of a right to exist as that of its neighbours. And this is a fact the Russian leadership is quietly aware of when you look behind the propaganda smokescreen, because after Yanukovych was ousted, they accepted the results of the elections that followed. And we can't forget that Russia annexed Crimea in a process completely counter to the Ukrainian constitution, so their appeals to legality are obviously paper thin. But there's one narrative that particularly has had a lot of influence in the West when it comes to attempting to whitewash the invasion: the Proxy War narrative. This argument particularly appeals to Western leftists and anti-war activists, and for understandable reasons. There's already a brewing sentiment that the world is nearing or already in a new Cold War. And the first Cold War was dominated by proxy war conflicts. Hot wars for the proxies, but cold wars for the big players. And when we look at recent conflicts involving the West, they do look like proxy wars in the style of the first Cold War. Whether that's the Syrian civil war, where US-backed rebels faced off against Russia-backed government forces, or the intervention in Afghanistan against the Taliban, where the Afghan government was essentially propped up by US-led coalition forces, crumbling as soon as they gave up on the conflict. And there's no doubt that if this is the Second Cold War, and we would argue it is, Ukraine is one of its first battlegrounds. The US and the rest of the Western world are essentially fighting Russia by proxy, rather than confronting Russian forces directly. Western-made tanks, armoured vehicles, missiles, small arms and more are doing that job in the hands of the Ukrainian fighters. But that's not necessarily the same as Ukraine being a proxy. For Ukraine to be a proxy, it would have to essentially act as a client state, in other words, a puppet, with the NATO alliance being the puppet masters. And of course, if you ask the Kremlin, that's exactly what's going on. Russian leaders and media platforms have been promoting the idea that the West is fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, claiming that all the West has to do to end the conflict is let go. The idea is that if the Russians and Ukrainians were left to sort this out themselves, they would quickly agree to peace, because Ukrainians don't really want to fight, it's just their puppet masters forcing them to. Presenting Ukraine as a proxy is a strategy the Kremlin has used to shift the responsibility for the conflict from the party that started it, Russia, to third parties, and this clearly has been an effective strategy in some circles. The proxy war line is a message that many Western leftists and conservatives have resonated with self-proclaimed anti-war and anti-imperialist activists supporting Russia, or at a minimum downplaying their guilt in the conflict, repeating Kremlin talking points casting Kiev as the new Kabul. But is that realistic? Not really. As we mentioned in the second episode of this series, every forceful escalation of this conflict has been due to the actions of Russia, not Ukraine or the West. The Euromaidan started when Russia pressured the Ukrainian government to drop their plans to join the EU, plans that were being carried out by President Yanukovych, who was considered broadly pro-Russian. The war in Donbass that followed resulted from Russia giving extensive military aid to the separatists, and the full-scale Ukraine war after that once again was started by the Kremlin, after Putin gave the order to cross the borders. These are all actions that Russia was not forced to take. They were conscious choices. Did Ukraine and the West respond? Yes, they did, and sometimes very badly. But they responded to the crisis. They didn't start it. So the idea that the West is simply dragging Ukraine into war is just not true. In fact, it's often been the case that despite all of the Western aid it's been getting in both arms and money, Kiev has still conducted the war on its own terms. In April 2023, following a massive leak of classified US military documents, it emerged that the US was resorting to spying on Ukraine to understand its plans, with the Pentagon reportedly having a better idea of what Russia was up to than Ukraine, although it seems coordination has increased since those April leaks. And when we look at how the Ukrainians have repeatedly pushed the boundaries of what aid Western countries were willing to deliver to their country, it seems less like NATO dragging Ukraine around and more like the opposite. And as for the chances of peace now, the idea that Ukraine has been looking for peace and the West has forced them back also lacks credibility. For example, we looked into this article written by activists from an organisation called Code Pink for Peace. It asks why the US government continues to prolong the conflict and reject the resumption of promising peace negotiations that it blocked in 2022. We followed the chain of sources for this claim, going from another news article to a Twitter feed by Aaron Mate, a reporter from an outlet called The Grey Zone. Aaron's thread includes a quote from former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, claiming that NATO broke off talks between Ukraine and Russia. And this brings us to the last link on the chain. That quote comes from an almost 5-hour-long interview with Bennett called Bennett Speaks.
ראש הממשלה לשעבר נפתלי בנט.
Shalom.
The section on Ukraine is roughly an hour. We watched it and it paints a different picture than that short quote from Aaron's feed. In the interview, Bennett confirms that he worked to organise talks between Ukraine and Russia, but far from these negotiations being opposed by the West, they were supported. Bennett explained that besides Turkish President Erdogan, he was essentially the only political leader left that had the ear of both Russia and the West, explaining that his talks were coordinated with US President Joe Biden, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and of course, President Zelensky himself. Bennett stated that in the first week of the war, he had obtained some key agreements from both sides. Putin compromised on the disarmament of Ukraine, while Zelensky compromised on joining NATO. But this wasn't a working agreement. There were two key remaining issues: territory and security guarantees. Ukraine, of course, wanted all of its former territory back, including the separatist-held areas in Donbass and the Crimean Peninsula. Russia wanted to preserve or incorporate the separatist republics and maintain its hold on Crimea. As for security, Bennett claimed that in exchange for agreeing not to join NATO, Zelensky wanted Ukraine to have direct security guarantees from the US instead. Bennett told Zelensky that this was impossible. The idea that the US would directly send troops into Ukraine, especially after the disaster that was Afghanistan, was crazy. What Bennett instead worked out was something he called the Israeli model. His theory was that Israel has no alliances or security guarantees, but instead ensures its own security with its strong military. And the same blueprint could be used for Ukraine. Ukraine would be a neutral but strong country. This resolved most of the issues, but it still left open the question of territory, where the stances of Ukraine and Russia were radically far apart from each other. Bennett's idea was essentially to set up a ceasefire, leaving the territorial questions to be settled down the road. But before that could happen, Bennett said that the defining moment that killed the talks was the Bucha massacre, which he called a Kafir Khana event, an unexpected civilian tragedy that would break off the dialogue. As for the Western powers, Bennett split them into several groups on a spectrum from confrontation to pragmatism, with Boris Johnson on the confrontation side, French President Macron and Chancellor Scholz on the pragmatic side, and Joe Biden somewhere in the middle. When he said that the West blocked the talks, he explained the issue like this. He didn't see the Ukraine conflict as a matter of national security for Israel, so he wasn't willing to act unilaterally. He wanted to coordinate everything with Germany, France, the US, Russia, and Ukraine, with everyone operating on the same page. When Ukraine stopped cooperating due to Bucha, and the Western powers also pulled out over the talks, he gave up. He also said that, in retrospect, it was too soon to know if a ceasefire would have been the right idea, speculating that the upside would have been an end to the casualties, but the downside would have been that agreeing a ceasefire after Putin had carried out an invasion of Ukraine could have been seen as rewarding thuggery, sending the wrong message worldwide. In other words, the chances for a real peace over this conflict were far more murky and complicated than the pro-Russian narrative of Ukraine and Russia being on the same page, with the meddling West being the only barrier. And of course, as things are now, establishing a lasting peace is much harder, because not only has Putin claimed Donbass and Crimea, but also Zaporizhia and Kherson, insisting that Ukraine must accept these lands as part of Russia if peace is to be agreed. It's important to point out that while Crimea and Donbass are mostly Russian-speaking regions, Zaporizhia and Kherson are primarily Ukrainian-speaking. It's a big demand for Ukraine to give up any land, but Putin demanding Ukrainians give up regions that are majority Ukrainian is even more of a stretch. So as we can see, it's very far from the case that the only thing blocking Ukraine from settling a peace is outside interference from the West. The Kremlin's idea of peace itself is also a massive barrier. So, is this conflict a dangerous flashpoint of a new Cold War? Most likely, yes. But is Ukraine a simple chess piece with no agency of its own? Definitely not.
Joining me now is Diliana Gaitanjeva, a Bulgarian investigative journalist and Middle East correspondent. She's also the founder of Arms Watch, which is an independent investigative journalism platform that tracks weapons and documents war crimes. Diliana, it's my pleasure to welcome you on the program. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
The last main narrative we've heard to justify the war is what we could call the Biolabs narrative. It's the second component of Russia's so-called WMD clause, justifying their invasion of Ukraine. The first being the nuclear weapons claims we discussed earlier. The claim essentially is that secret biolabs sponsored by the West were stationed in Ukraine, potentially to be used for attacks on Russia, justifying Russia's narrative that their attack on Ukraine was self-defense. To look into these allegations, we turned once again to Richard Medhurst to discuss the Biolabs claims. Medhurst published a video featuring Bulgarian journalist Diliana Gaitanjeva. The first allegation Diliana made was that the US Embassy in Ukraine had deleted documents referring to the Biolabs from their website. This is also a claim she made on Twitter. Just 2 days after the invasion began, she claimed that the embassy had removed documents related to 11 Pentagon-funded biolabs from their website, posting screenshots of the documents under the tagline, "These are the documents which the US Embassy does not want you to see." We checked the embassy website itself, and here's what we found. The biolabs and the documents do indeed exist. That much is true. But the claim that the embassy tried to delete them from their website is not. The embassy has a page specifically dedicated to their biological program in Ukraine, and the documents Diliana mentioned are attached as PDFs on the side, labelled as fact sheets. When we clicked on the PDF links, they were all accessible and free to read, detailing the laboratories and the Pentagon's involvement in them. The documentation refers to the Biolab program as a bio-threat reduction mission, where pathogens and toxins of security concern will be consolidated and secured, as well as the use of mobile labs for COVID-19 prevention. So, far from being hidden smoking guns revealing a plot to unleash pathogens as weapons, these documents refer to a program to prevent disease and study viruses to help prepare for future pandemics. But despite these documents not really following the implication of the narrative, Diliana turns to suggestion to imply these labs are used for weaponization, asking leading questions such as,
what is the purpose of the Pentagon funding such military program in Ukraine, not only in Ukraine? Why would the Pentagon spend or the US government spend $2.5 billion on the health of foreign citizens instead of on the health of its own citizens? What is the Pentagon doing? And why have so many deaths been indicated in the documents as unknown? But why isn't the Pentagon why is the Pentagon funding such projects abroad, not on its own territory? Why in Ukraine? Why in Georgia? Why in Armenia or in Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan? All countries bordering on Russia. To research deadly viruses, bacteria and toxins. Why do they need diplomatic immunity in the first place? They are not diplomats. However, they have the immunity that actually gives them the right to move freely around the country, to do whatever they want and to enjoy diplomatic immunity against prosecution.
She then states that these are bioagents which, if developed, could be used as bioweapons, and that there are other labs near Pentagon rivals like China and Iran. To which Medhurst says,
that speaks volumes on its own. You don't need to be a genius to figure this one out.
Again, the power of suggestion at play. Because they don't have proof of their narrative, Diliana and Richard rely on questions and speculations that don't outright claim these labs are a bioweapons plot by the US against their enemies, but they make that implication very obvious. When we looked into the locations of these labs, however, the picture looks a little different. While some of these labs are located around the former Soviet Union, others are not. For example, several of these Pentagon labs are located in Africa, which, if you know your geography, is quite far from Iran, China, and Russia. Diliana's reports of deaths allegedly caused by this biolab program are also rather dubious. In a report on her website, she claimed that 20 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and 200 hospitalized in the Kharkiv region, the location of one of the Pentagon-backed labs. The source for this claim was an outlet called the Donbass News Agency, which published the allegations in an article called "Deadly Virus Leaked from US Laboratory in Donbass." It turns out that the original source for the allegation comes from a situation report issued by the Vice Commander of the Donetsk Army, Edward Basurin. No evidence is provided, it's just a quote from a press conference. Another claim from Diliana's website was that a bioterrorism agent from the Pentagon labs was a prime suspect in botulism cases in Ukraine. This claim didn't even have a source, and Diliana admitted that the local authorities had actually mentioned food poisoning as their explanation for the cases. And it turns out that these dodgy claims are far from new either. When we looked further into Diliana and her alleged biowarfare research, we came across this article from the BBC monitoring outlet. As far back as 2018, Diliana has been making these claims of Western countries meddling with bioweapons. In an interview with Russia One, one of the main state TV channels in Russia, Diliana accused the Pentagon of funding a secret test exposing commuters travelling on London's underground rail network to chemical gas. But BBC monitoring revealed that this test was far from secret, and in fact was publicly announced in advance, with a list of all the stations the test would take place in included in the announcement. The article explained that the test involved non-hazardous materials. So we have suggestions, unreliable claims, and outright lies. These are the supposed pieces of evidence pro-Russia commentators have to support the biolabs narrative. But these narratives don't just come from reporters like Diliana. The Russian Defense Ministry has directly promoted these claims in its own press conferences. In August 2023, the head of the ministry's Bioweapons Defense Forces claimed in a press conference that there was a possible plot by Big Pharma and USAID, a US government agency, to spread a new coronavirus. The minister further implied that these groups were behind the previous COVID pandemic and other outbreaks like bird flu and African swine plague. And that's the key word: possible. It wasn't stated as a fact, because facts require a pesky thing called evidence. To support their claims, the Defense Ministry linked 2 US government documents on their article, but as with Diliana's embassy documents, they don't tell the story the Kremlin wants them to tell. One document is the US National Biosecurity Strategy, and the other is a document referring to PREDICT, a program related to virus detection that was extended to help combat the COVID pandemic. Neither of these papers are smoking guns proving some kind of conspiracy to use bioweapons against US rivals. So Diliana and the Kremlin essentially follow the same strategy. Take the real documents and stories related to biolabs and virus research, and then enhance them into sinister conspiracies with the power of speculation. That's not to say we should never speculate. We often have to. It's rare that we have all the facts when dealing with complex topics like these. But when you don't have evidence in front of you, just theories, consider how much of a leap you're being asked to make. Is it possible that the Pentagon has secret bioweapons that we don't know about? Secret labs producing them and documents detailing every last detail of plans to kill and poison? Hypothetically? Sure. But hypothetically, a lot of things could be true. We went from the known fact of these labs existing, to them being used to develop weapons, to these weapons being involved in a plot against Russia, justifying Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a defensive strike against a Western conspiracy. And we were encouraged to make all of these leaps without any actual proof of it. This all comes back to a lesson we mentioned in the original Ukraine Narratives documentary. Focus on what you're being shown, not what you're being told. Diliana shows the Biolabs document and tells you that they're what the US government doesn't want you to see. In reality, they're on a public website that's free to access. The Kremlin shows these biosecurity and pandemic prevention documents and tells you that the US might be behind all of the world's recent outbreaks. But that's not the story the documents tell. So remember to be careful, because suggestion can be a powerful thing. In our original Ukraine Narratives documentary, we mentioned in passing that the Russians and Ukrainians of this conflict had accused each other of genocide. Much like the topic of how Ukraine historically progressed towards the current war, this is an issue that now must be explored in more depth. To understand claims of genocide, we first have to understand what genocide actually is. The UN has a page dedicated to this topic, explaining the meaning of genocide in great detail.
The word genocide was first coined by Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944 in his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. It consists of the Greek prefix genos, meaning race or tribe, and the Latin suffix cide, meaning killing. Lemkin developed the term partly in response to the Nazi policies of systematic murder of Jewish people during the Holocaust, but also in response to previous instances in history of targeted actions aimed at the destruction of particular groups of people. Later on, Raphael Lemkin led the campaign to have genocide recognized and codified as an international crime. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The popular understanding of what constitutes genocide tends to be broader than the content of the norm under international law. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention contains a narrow definition of the crime of genocide, which includes two main elements. 1. A mental element, the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And 2. A physical element, which includes the following 5 acts, enumerated exhaustively: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The intent is the most difficult element to determine. To constitute genocide, there must be a proven intent on the part of perpetrators to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Importantly, the victims of genocide are deliberately targeted, not randomly, because of their real or perceived membership of one of the 4 groups protected under the Convention, which excludes political groups, for example. This means that the target of destruction must be the group as such and not its members as individuals. Genocide can also be committed against only a part of the group, as long as that part is identifiable, including within a geographically limited area, and substantial.
In short, genocide is an attempt to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, partially or fully. And for a crime to be considered genocide, it must have been committed deliberately and knowingly. And we all know what accusations of genocide imply: cold, calculated mass murder on an industrial scale. We all know the one case study burned into everyone's mind when we hear this word: the Holocaust. The Russian state's constant comparisons with Nazism and World War II when talking about the Ukraine conflict show a very deliberate attempt to exploit this mental image. A world where Ukraine is a modern-day fascist project, attempting to exterminate the victimized Russian world. The narrative was that for 8 years, the world had ignored a silent massacre of Donbass by Ukraine, almost as if to draw a parallel with those who turned a blind eye to the treatment of the Jews by the Nazis. Ironic, when you consider that only a few months before the so-called special military operation, the Russian authorities were still proclaiming that they had no involvement in the Donbass conflict. But that aside, how close is this rhetoric to the truth? Well, there clearly is an ethnic and cultural element to the Ukraine conflict. It began in 2014, with a split between segments of Ukrainian society that wanted to stay tied to Russia, struggling against those who wanted to assert a separate Ukrainian identity. And when that conflict turned into war, these divisions became sounded out with guns and bombs. People have died because of these identity crises and prejudices. Since the war began, language in particular has become a highly politicized topic, with Ukrainian disappearing from schooling and Russian being made the sole state language in separatist territories, and Ukrainian becoming the sole state language in Ukrainian territories, with quotas on its use in the media being enforced. On both sides of the divide, linguistics became not just a hot-button issue, but a definer of political loyalties. The results of this can be clearly seen. Polls in 2012 showed that 40% of Ukraine's population claimed Russian as their native language. 10 years later, that number had dropped to 16%. In just a single decade, the number of people claiming Russian as their mother tongue had more than halved. And as for the separatist population, when Ukrainian was axed from schools in the Donetsk Republic, separatists claimed that no one at all, wanted Ukrainian to be the language their children were taught in. If we were to take these statements at face value, apparently the number of Ukrainian speakers in the Donbass is something like 0%. With figures like these, we can see that this politicization of language created an imposing cultural atmosphere where people feel uncomfortable for speaking their own mother tongues for fear of being seen as an enemy. This is a process that hasn't just been going on for weeks or months, but years. Let this sink in for a second. Imagine waking up one day and all the TV stations are speaking a language you don't understand. You go to school one day and suddenly your teacher is speaking in this language too, and you're at risk of being seen as a traitor if you don't walk along this uncanny valley. For a point of comparison elsewhere in Europe, we could look to Switzerland and its 3 main languages: German, French, and Italian. 4 in every 6 Swiss speaking German, the others speaking French and Italian. Imagine if German suddenly became the country's sole language, French speakers and Italian speakers no longer accommodated. The damage that would do to such a multilingual society. That's what happened here. So culturally speaking, the Ukrainians and Russians have been chipping away at each other. But in no way has this escalated to industrial-scale genocide, no matter how many times this message is repeated. And the proof is in the data. Before the invasion of 2022, more people were dying from car accidents than war deaths in the Donetsk region. In 2021, there were 77 deaths from the conflict on separatist territory, only 7 of these being civilians. Naturally, you will ask, where does this data come from? How can we trust that this isn't NATO or Ukrainian propaganda, aimed at covering up unthinkable atrocities? Well, the data comes from the pro-Russian separatists themselves. Yes, really. The same separatists pushing the genocide line, telling us tales of a modern-day Holocaust to present a pretext for Russian intervention. We found this data from an anti-war Russian publication known as System Block, and they sourced it from an official of the Donetsk People's Republic government, their human rights ombudsman, who has published official statistics on the conflict annually. This is the least pro-Ukraine source you could get, official data from the faction fighting Ukraine, and it still doesn't even come close to validating sensationalist charges of genocide. Donetsk is a region with over 2 million people in its population. Divide 2 million by 77 and you get 25,974. So let's assume that the conflict had continued at this death rate, with no Russian intervention year after year. It would take the Ukrainians over 25,000 years to wipe out Donetsk. Now, in fairness, 77 was just for 21. In previous years, the numbers varied from as high as several hundred to as low as 44. So it might not be 25,000 years. It could be 30,000 or 10,000. But the point is, if the Ukrainians are attempting a Holocaust, they are certainly in no rush. Now, of course, if we were to look at data from 2022, post-invasion, when Ukraine retaliated against Russia with its own accusations of genocide, things would be very different in the scale of losses. The UN has recorded almost 7,000 civilian conflict deaths, over double the total from the previous 7 years of the Russo-Ukrainian War. If we were to include military figures as well, the number would probably be in the hundreds of thousands by now. And the reason for this spike is obvious. It's because the scope of the conflict has massively expanded, with many more regions being involved in the hostilities and much more active fighting taking place. It was the Russians who decided on that expansion, not the Ukrainians. Vladimir Putin has developed an image of his forces as protectors, yet their actions have doubled the casualty count of the Russo-Ukrainian War in only a fraction of the time. But nonetheless, these events didn't take place because the Russians suddenly decided to join the Hitler Reenactment Society. There is a high bar to prove genocide, including both actions and mindset, and that bar simply hasn't been met. Genocide isn't just a pattern of behaviour, it's also a pattern of mindset, fixated around extermination, of branding the target group with a sense of otherness to justify the crime. If we look at official rhetoric, Russian leaders, especially Putin, have promoted the opposite mindset, togetherness rather than otherness, through their skewed view of history that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. This is not the kind of mentality you would expect a genocider to hold. You would never hear a leader like Adolf Hitler declaring Jews and Germans as one people. There is a clear attempt to attack the Ukrainian identity here, but not the Ukrainian people. This is the key difference. It's a misguided saviour complex, not a murder complex. To justify these genocide allegations, some analysts point to Russia's use of dehumanising language regarding Ukraine, branding an unspecified amount of the population as either Nazis or brainwashed by Nazism, using derogatory language like Ukrop to refer to the Ukrainian people, and they then connect this rhetoric to war crimes allegations, painting an image of a Holocaust-style systematic incitement and practice of destruction. But this ignores the fact that, unfortunately, dehumanisation is an often used tactic in war, for obvious reasons. It's easier to kill an enemy soldier if he's less of a person to you, an other, a chess piece on the board to be knocked over. And this is a mentality the Ukrainians have incorporated as well, referring to Russians as orcs brainwashed by Z-mania. We can look at other examples from this century as well. We have tended to compare the Russian invasion of Ukraine with the US invasion of Iraq in this series, and we can see rhetorical parallels here as well. Despite claims of liberation, US politicians deliberately exploited imagery of terrorist attacks which Iraqis had no part in to define an unspecified amount of the Iraqi population as terrorists or terrorist supporters, demanding de-Baathification much as Russia now demands denazification. The effect of historical distortions and vague charges like these is dehumanization. And while the intention is to make it easier to fight war, it also, for some, makes it easier to commit or condone atrocities. When you paint a group, or an unspecified sect of a group, as the enemy, it can promote an attitude that brutalizing this group is, in some way, acceptable. But despite this rhetoric, the occupation, and the atrocities perpetrated against the Iraqi people, it would be sensationalistic and flat out wrong to claim Iraqis were subjected to genocide in this conflict. Additionally, outright racism is sometimes used as a dehumanizing tactic to aid war morale, and there is a historical record of this. One of the most stark examples being the rhetoric towards the Japanese people during World War II, who were referred to as Japs, made targets of caricature, isolation and ridicule, and placed in concentration camps because of a perception that an unspecified number of them were fascists, loyalists to the Japanese Empire. This rhetoric reached its maximum extent near the end of the war, where the Japanese people were warned that if they did not unconditionally surrender, prompt and utter destruction would follow. In spite of these practices, we rightly do not accuse the USA, or the Allies as a whole, of attempting to commit genocide against the Japanese people. The point of showing these other case studies is not to excuse the use of dehumanizing rhetoric, or to undermine the importance of analysing and condemning it, because as previously mentioned, dehumanizing rhetoric leads to atrocities, even if that isn't its intention. But the point is that racism, dehumanization and cruel language, even though it enables cruel behaviour, especially in wartime, does not in itself indicate genocide. Genocide is not just a charge of atrocities. It is the furthest an atrocity can go. Of the genocide allegations that seem most likely on the surface to point to a kind of genocidal intent are the allegations of forced transfers of populations, which are one of the actions listed under the Genocide Convention. In September 2022, the NGO Human Rights Watch presented an extensive report on these claims, which included witness testimonies. What was described was a series of restrictions on freedom of movement, alleging Russian authorities forced Ukrainian citizens to flee to Russia against their will. In most of these examples, interviewees described usually having 4 choices: privately travelling to their place of choice, including to Ukrainian-held areas, remaining in their current areas, travelling further into Russian-annexed territory, to refugee centres in the Donetsk People's Republic, or travelling to Russia itself. The forced element of the transfer was described as the refusal of Russian authorities to organise transport to Ukrainian-held areas, only offering transit to either the DPR or mainland Russia, rather than Russian forces physically forcing civilians to leave for Russia. Interviewees travelling privately described being able to leave for Ukrainian territory by Russian forces, despite pressure not to do so, and those who had been evacuated to Russia described being allowed to leave for neighbouring nations and then proceed onwards to Western Europe. In this sense, it appears that in some ways the Russian authorities allowed more freedom of movement than the Ukrainian authorities, as the Ukrainian government has entirely banned military-age men from leaving the country. And the analysis from Human Rights Watch noted instances of Ukrainians from this demographic voluntarily choosing to leave for Russia in order to move on to other countries. An allegation related to forced transfers much closer to what is described under the Genocide Convention is the claim by Ukrainian authorities of mass kidnappings of Ukrainian children by Russian and pro-Russian forces, for the purpose of de-Ukrainianizing them, overseeing their placement with Russian foster families. The Human Rights Watch report notes an incident where children living in the Donetsk city of Mariupol, some from birth families and others from foster families, weren't collected by their parents during the battle for the city, noting that when a volunteer attempted to take them to Ukrainian-controlled territory to reunite them with their families, they were blocked by Russian and pro-Russian authorities, who claimed the city to be territory of the Donetsk People's Republic. Under DPR law, the volunteer was not allowed to take the children out of the country into Ukraine, leading to family separation. According to the report, some of these children later passed through to Russia and then onwards to Western Europe, where they reunited with their parents, while the whereabouts of the others are unknown. Looking at the behaviour described in the report, this does not appear to be a purposeful policy of family separation, but rather a consequence of attempts by Russian forces to create a border between Ukraine and Russian annexed regions, a similar issue to the separation of families that was caused by the division of Germany through the inner German border and the Berlin Wall. This does not appear to show a kind of genocidal intent or genocidal policy, especially when we consider the fact that according to the interviewees, those who did transfer to Russia were able to leave. Condemnable as it is, annexation is not extermination. These allegations of a widespread genocidal policy are also undermined by a lack of evidence for practices on that scale. For example, the Human Rights Watch report noted that the Ukrainian government had claimed over 200,000 children had been kidnapped by Russian forces, but they were not able to verify this number, and the number they were able to document from the earlier mentioned incident was only 17. The report also noted that the Ukrainian government had claimed the total number of citizens forcibly transferred to Russia was 1.2 million. The report documented 18 transfers and spoke to 21 others who reported their relatives had been transferred. Of course, this is only one organisation trying to comprehend an overwhelming refugee crisis, but the fact remains that as things stand, there is a wide gulf between the allegations and the evidence. The number of 1.2 million Ukrainians transferred to Russia may actually be accurate, as the report cites Russian state media claiming a total of 2.8 million, half of which held passports from the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. The other half would seemingly be Ukrainian passport holders or those without documents. But this is just the total transferred, with no detail on the circumstances behind these transfers. We don't know how many of these were voluntary, how many migrated because they felt pressured, and how many migrated because they were forced to do so. Without a much wider investigation, based on more than testimony, this claim of over 1 million kidnappings is unsubstantiated. The idea that it can be taken as proof of a policy of genocide even more so. Making these kinds of claims and utilising them for propaganda purposes without sufficient evidence is extremely damaging for public trust. In the English language, many words are used loosely and hyperbolically, and for the most part, this is a fine and normal thing. It's good to have a lot of leeway on how you express yourself, some linguistic breathing room to get a point across. But there are some words that shouldn't be given this breathing room, and genocide is one of them. Genocide is one of the worst accusations you could ever level at a person or group. It's a word that represents some of the most barbaric, savage elements of humanity, the lowest of the low. It's a term that should be used sparingly and on a factual basis, not as a cheap propaganda tool. Think about some other examples. Words that used to be very specific, very powerful terms. Fascist, racist, and even Nazi. These kinds of things used to be serious accusations, and now they're treated by some like generic buzzwords, things that can be tossed around as just another word for something I don't like. I don't want to see genocide, a word that represents one of the worst crimes against humanity imaginable, used in the same way. That would be a spit in the face of those who fell victim to these very real atrocities. Genocide is always an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's why countering bogus, unproven, or sensationalistic genocide allegations is so important, because this is a term that should maintain its integrity that other words like it have lost.
You are always just one tap or a click away from accessing a whole new realm of information, which originates from beyond our country's borders. Some of this information is useful. A lot of it is not, and a significant amount of data is manufactured, designed to mislead, uplift, or beat down masses of people. Depending on what that goal of the author is, these lies and half-truths go by many names. Misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, fake news, and alternative facts, being just a few. Fear or distrust of the media and the risk of outlets spreading false narratives is not new by any means, but in the last few years, public consciousness on the topic of misinformation and the attempts to combat it through fact-checking has catapulted into the mainstream. A major catalyst for this was the 2016 election in the USA, an election marked by extreme polarization, where the two key camps, Democrats and Republicans, didn't just have completely different views, but completely different sources of news. And the dispute over these sources is where the term fake news became popularized, amplified by the presidential candidate Donald Trump's routine denunciations of the fake news media, denunciations that his supporters then adopted widespread. And this polarization has only increased since then. You may not live in the US, but it still affects you. This isn't just a US problem, it's a worldwide one. Trust in the media is at a dramatic low across much of the world. But believe it or not, there is a positive side to this issue. Attempts to promote media literacy are on the rise. Rather than simply combating false narratives, resources are being published to show the public how to identify misinformation themselves. Sound advice like how to identify sources, consider the motives of publishers, and the context surrounding the news we consume. And this is a process we have participated in the mega project too. With our Yeonmi Park in North Korea production, we successfully pushed activist Yeonmi Park to take down misleading material about North Korea. In our Ukraine Narratives production, we gave a crash course on how context can be removed to paint a misleading picture of events. And in this production, The Ukrainian Divide, we've taken that work further by unveiling more context and addressing misleading rhetoric. Go back a decade or two, and these kinds of productions would be all but impossible to make. So while the interconnectivity of the internet has allowed misleading agitators to spread their messaging further than ever before, it has also allowed honest analysts to do the same thing. Let's look at a small case study. This is a post from the social media site Quora, claiming that Chinese state media have proposed that Ukraine be subjected to a Cold War-style division between East and West. It uses this map as proof. Using Google image search, we can find the earliest appearances of this map on the web, and it can be traced back to a Twitter post from a user called Zhao Dashui, who takes credit for the map. Since we were able to follow the chain back to the original source, we can tell that the claim in the Quora post is fake. This isn't any sort of state media outlet. It's a random blogger on Twitter. And if we look up China's actual announcement of their Ukraine peace plan, it doesn't include any sort of maps splitting Ukraine at all. It actually mentions the need to support territorial integrity for all countries. A fact that Ukraine's President Zelensky noted shortly after the plan was announced, saying, "China respects historical integrity. Let's work with China on this point, why not?" The plan also specifically condemns the Cold War mentality, further showing that the idea China is proposing a Cold War-style division of Ukraine is nonsense. In the pre-internet era of letters, books, word of mouth, and newspapers, cross-referencing like this was nearly impossible. And the ability for individual audience members to fact-check the information they received was almost zero. You had nothing to go on beyond common knowledge, hunches, or personal experience. the radio and television eras increased our reference points, with the ability for recording to demonstrate happenings directly. But this era still left control over information in the hands of large organizations, the broadcasters. Now, for the first time, sovereignty over information is in the hands of the audiences. You can evaluate the news for yourself. The tools are there to make this possible. That is unprecedented. But the freedom provided by the internet is not a freedom we should take for granted. Internet censorship is already a reality in most countries around the world, and most recently, the invasion of Ukraine has exposed the cracks in this freedom. In our Ukraine Narratives documentary, we reported on how Russia implemented major restrictions on reporting surrounding the Ukraine conflict, with the country's media regulator Roskomnadzor restricting social media and demanding outlets reporting on undesirable news or referring to the conflict as a war, invasion, or an attack on Ukraine delete their posts or face being blacklisted. Since the release of that documentary, restrictions have gotten tougher. In March 2022, the Russian parliament, the State Duma, amended the country's media laws several times in order to broaden their scope and increase the punishments for defiance. Now, not only is discrediting the Russian military illegal, so is discrediting any Russian state body operating abroad. Punishments include fines between 700,000 to 1.5 million rubles, which are approximately 8,800 to 19,000 euros, or a prison sentence of 3 years. Fines between 3 to 5 million rubles, which approximately are 38,000 to 63,000 euros, or a prison sentence between 5 to 10 years if the crime involves so-called artificial evidence, mercenary motives, or a basis of political, ideological, racial, national, or religious hatred or enmity. And lastly, a guaranteed jail term of between 10 to 15 years if the crime causes so-called serious consequences. And in April 2022, the Duma went further by unveiling a new bill to expand the criteria for Russia's so-called foreign agent regulations. The foreign agent regulations are a series of rules that have existed in Russia since 2012, where political groups receiving foreign funding have had to declare themselves as foreign agents, and prominently showcase these declarations on their media posts. But the Duma's April plans essentially removed the foreign funding criteria, allowing news outlets and NGOs to be designated as agents even if they didn't receive any money from abroad. Instead, authorities could rely on the vague criteria of foreign influence to justify the foreign agent charge. In July 2022, these changes were approved and became law. Later in March 2023, the law against discrediting Russian forces was extended again, increasing maximum prison sentences and expanding the scope of the law to include all pro-Russian volunteers in the conflict. Where previously only the official Russian military was protected, silencing critics of paramilitary units like Wagner Group or Rusich. To put things simply, if you go too far in criticizing any of the arms of the Russian forces operating in Ukraine, you can be branded a foreign puppet. You can have your finances crippled, and you can be shut off from the outside world for over a decade if the authorities can tick a few boxes, making independent reporting on controversial topics like the Ukraine conflict essentially impossible. A noose is being wrapped around the neck of Russia's media. They are being strangled more and more as the war goes on. And as the conflict progresses, the Russian government has become increasingly more intolerant of dissent. As a result of these deranged laws, many Russian opposition journalists and publications have been forced to relocate outside of Russia in order to continue publishing about the war without fear. while others have been forced to stop reporting on the war or close their doors altogether. And if it wasn't bad enough, Roskomnadzor has deployed a brand new tool to streamline their censorship process, a new AI known as Oculus, which is designed to scrub anti-war material and other content the Russian authorities deem undesirable from the net at record pace, reportedly scanning more than 200,000 images a day, one every 3 seconds, compared to the 106 images a day processed manually by Roskomnadzor's regulators. Safe to say, this is all a far cry from the days of Glasnost. And again, as described in the Ukraine narratives, this media crackdown is not just limited to Russia. It's happening in the West too. Previously we reported that YouTube had blocked access to RT across its platform. But now things have escalated to a lot further than that. Russian state media outlets RT and Sputnik are now legally banned entirely across the EU and UK, with their broadcasts cut off and their website blocked. In response to the EU censorship policies, Google explained their approach towards Russian media in a March 2022 blog post titled "Helping Ukraine," where they announced they were working to significantly limit recommendations globally for a number of Russian state-funded media outlets and remove Russian state media apps across their platforms. They also promised to prioritize content from authoritative news sources. In the post, they also noted that they had linked the EU's takedown requests to a platform called the Lumen database. The request they provided, sent by the European Commission, contained a number of disturbing remarks. It demands that the banned Russian state publications be blocked from transmission or distribution by any means, such as cable, satellite, IPTV, internet service providers, internet video sharing platforms, or applications. It also singles out search engines as playing a decisive role in providing internet users with access to the content of their choosing, and facilitating the public's access to the content of RT and Sputnik, including a demand that all RT and Sputnik related content be removed from search results. The request clarifies that posts from anyone reproducing RT and Sputnik content must be deleted, not just posts from RT and Sputnik's own accounts. The request also mentions issues relating to freedom of speech, but it describes freedom of speech as the right to report objectively on and the right to receive objective information on current events, and says that this right can be restricted for legitimate public interest in a proportionate manner. In short, the EU Commission has decided that an outlet only has a right to free expression if the Commission believes it reports objectively. If the Commission believes an outlet isn't reporting objectively, it has every right to erase the outlet from the internet and stop you from finding it in search results, even if you are specifically looking for it. And as a result of this, Google, the search engine almost everyone in the Western world and most of the wider world uses, will go out of its way to promote sources it considers to be authoritative and downgrade those it believes not to be authoritative, taking the choice of users to find what they're searching for away in exchange for feeds curated by companies and governments. Curiously, according to the European Commission itself, this media ban apparently is compliant with Article 11 of EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights, which relates to freedom of expression and information. The article reads as follows. First, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. Second, the freedom and pluralism of the media shall be respected. This article clearly states that media of any type, whether it be the news, opinion pieces, analyses, or works created for artistic expression, are protected under EU law. there is a promise of a lack of government interference relating to published works. Another important addition to this fundamental right is that the freedom and pluralism of the media shall be respected, meaning that outlets spanning a variety of fields, affiliations, opinions are protected by European law. Nowhere in this article is a distinction made between outlets that appear to be objective and outlets that appear to promote distortions, as the Commission's interpretation suggests. In fact, the specific inclusions of pluralism and non-interference regardless of frontiers as fundamental rights seems to leave no room to draw these arbitrary lines. EU lawmakers seem to be imagining exceptions that don't exist in order to justify these restrictions, which go against the fundamental right of free expression. And this right is seemingly being violated not only within the EU as a whole, but also as part of the rights of EU member states. Sandra Pereira, a Portuguese member of the European Parliament, posed a parliamentary question to the European Commission relating to this regulation, under the topic Media Censorship Imposed on Member States by EU Regulation. She said the following.
With this regulation, the EU is overstepping its powers and encroaching on those of member states. The regulation infringes Article 37 of the Constitution of the Portuguese Republic, which has the following to say on the freedom of expression and information. 1. Everyone shall possess the right to freely express and disclose their thoughts in words, images, or by any other means, as well as the right to inform others, inform themselves, and be informed without hindrance or discrimination. 2. Exercise of said rights shall not be hindered or limited by any type or form of censorship.
Pereira received an answer from a Commission Vice President Vera Jourova.
The temporary restriction, limited both in terms of content and geographical scope, was based on the fact that RT, formerly Russia Today, and Sputnik are under the permanent control of the leadership of the Russian Federation and essential and instrumental in supporting the Russian aggression against Ukraine as well as the destabilization of its neighbouring countries. It aims to protect the European public order and security from such a significant and direct threat and is a justified restriction to the right to freedom of expression and information enshrined in Article 11 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, since the outlets have been essential and instrumental in Russia's systematic international campaign of media manipulation and distortion of facts, in order to enhance its strategy of destabilization of the Union and its member states. RT France has brought an action for annulment against this measure. On the 30th of March 2022, the President of the General Court rejected RT France's request for an interim measure. A final judgment still needs to be delivered.
Jourova doesn't seem to realize or acknowledge that Article 11 is formulated without setting specific exceptions in place, which would exempt certain kinds of media from this fundamental right. At no point is another country's state media mentioned, nor that a statement or work needs to be factual in the first place to have a right to be expressed. Her response, together with the Council decision CFSP 2022-351, seem to show a reckless disregard for EU law. We have to remember that Article 11 is not just described as a right, but rather as a legally binding fundamental right, a foundation. How can this right be fundamental and binding if exceptions to it can be arbitrarily invented by politicians when it suits them? Exceptions that simply don't exist in the original text? And in a shocking display of hypocrisy, just a week after these bans on Russian media were put in place by the EU and UK, the Media Freedom Coalition, a grouping of various countries including EU nations and the UK, put out a statement expressing their outrage at Russia's decision to block Western outlets. Comparisons to 1984 and George Orwell are very tired and old these days, but There is a real feeling of doublespeak going on when the nations of the Media Freedom Coalition are restricting the media, then bashing other countries for doing the same thing. And this hypocrisy goes even further. A blog from the International Forum of Responsible Media notes that the day after World Press Freedom Day, the EU announced that it would extend the ban on 3 other state-controlled Russian media outlets. In that announcement, the European Commission listed the following outlets as being banned for, in the Commission's words, promoting disinformation: Russia Today, Sputnik, Rossiya, RTR/RTR Planeta, Rossiya 24/Russia 24, and TV Center International, in or directed at the EU, such as via cable, satellite, IPTV, platforms, websites, and apps. Half a dozen press outlets banned in all forms, the day after Press Freedom Day, by members of the Media Freedom Coalition. The jokes write themselves. As if that wasn't bad enough, the list was later expanded, again to include 9 more publications: NTV/NTV Mir, Rossiya 1, Ren TV, Pervi Kanal, Ria Fan, Oriental Review, Sargrad, New Eastern Outlook, and Kateon. These are regulations that have directly caused problems for us, as we've had to censor our own production to avoid going against EU laws. Which means when discussing RT, we've had to scrub their links from our sources list and show quotes from their sites as plain text, rather than website screenshots, because we're not allowed to reproduce their content. You may have also noticed earlier that when showing examples of maps being used to delegitimize Ukraine, we had to edit out the example of this tactic being used by pro-Russian think tanks. That's because the example we had was from an article by Kateon, which is on the sanctions list. Later in the documentary, chapter 9.5, we talk about how a fake video of a supposed war crime was spread around by pro-Russian outlets. We've had to remove some of the examples we used there as well, because they were from Ren TV and Sargrad, sanctioned outlets. In every one of these instances, these regulations have made the information environment worse, not better. This whole system is absolutely absurd, because it's impossible to dissect Russian propaganda if you can't refer to what it says, and it's unreasonable to expect reporters to cover a conflict between Russia and Ukraine without being able to refer to prominent Russian sources. But these are compromises that we have to make. Otherwise, Google would be forced to block our content in Europe, something that doesn't sit right with us as Europeans. Unfortunately, since YouTube is currently our main platform for these documentaries, this is the game we have to play. These rules aren't as severe as they could be, but these are editorial decisions we shouldn't have to make. So I just want to put out a heartfelt message to the people behind these regulations. I'm sure you mean well and you think that what you're doing is in our best interest, but fuck you. Sincerely, fuck you, go fuck yourself, fuck off, fuck you, fuck you. And it's not just Google that's complying with these censorship demands from the EU. Of the top 5 search engines used around the world, 4 of them are following measures to de-rank Russian state-backed media content. That's Google, Bing, Yahoo, which uses Bing's algorithm, and DuckDuckGo. The only one of those 5 that isn't doing this is Yandex, and that's because it's biasing things the other way, de-ranking or erasing pro-Western or Ukrainian narratives and promoting pro-Russian ones. That's because it's a Russian search engine, and so follows Russian censorship laws. Erasing images of protesters, prioritizing pro-Kremlin outlets, and blocking undesirable outlets and platforms. Put simply, unless you're in the 1% using an obscure, unconventional search engine, your searches are being put through a politicized filter. The excuse that search engine companies have for this is information quality. That their engines are simply doing what they're supposed to do, providing you with reliable, trustworthy results. Misinformation obviously isn't reliable, so deranking it is the natural thing to do. But this is a very misleading suggestion. DuckDuckGo, Google, and other search engine managers aren't checking through every published article, looking through its sources and context, and deciding case by case what is accurate and what is misleading. They're simply making a blanket assumption that some outlets are misleading and others are reliable. But that's not how this media environment works. Not every single story published by RT is going to be groundless propaganda, and not every story published by a Western outlet is going to be backed up by context and facts. So even if we were to assume that this censorship was justified if it promoted quality, that's not what's happening. It's censorship rooted in stereotypes. And that's exactly what deranking is. It might be a lesser kind of censorship than outright banning undesirable outlets, but it's still designed to limit the spread and impact of those outlets, and it still has the same aim: deciding what you can and cannot see. Obviously, search engines have to include some kind of bias, because anything you search for could lead to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of results, and somehow the engine has to choose which results come first. And when you only show 10 or so results per page, there has to be a strong algorithm to decide what those results are. But abusing that tool for political censorship is a dangerous game to play. It's important to remember that in the past, Google used to be committed to providing unbiased search results, and they committed themselves to challenging laws cracking down on internet freedom and freedom of speech. This threat to our rights isn't normal. It doesn't need to be normal. And thankfully, there are still things you can do to counteract it. For example, for our part, we've taken to using a browser called Vivaldi, which allows you to add as many search engines to your search bar as you like and switch between them on the fly. In one moment you can be searching a topic on Google, the next you can be using Yandex, DuckDuckGo, or any other number of search engines. And on top of that, there are search engines that give the user much more control over the algorithm than Google does. For example, Brave Search, which lets you customize the ranking system with extensions called goggles. Or U.com, which lets you derank or uprank results yourself through its preferred sources system. Alternatively, you could look at an engine like Mojik, which ditches user control in exchange for offering a genuine attempt at unbiased results, removing personalization as much as possible to minimize manipulation, and rejecting the idea that the views of their company should be passed down to users using their service. These are all different search tools made using different methodologies, but what they all have in common is a rejection of the censorship of governments and of the companies that comply with them, like Google or Yandex, where search queries can be tampered with behind the scenes to push you towards a certain view. And the best thing is, with a service like Vivaldi's search bar options, you don't have to make a choice between just one of these options. You can experiment with any number of them. The need to combat dubious narratives and misinformation is a very real one. We strongly believe this. That's what this whole episode is about. But that legitimate need is being exploited to enforce an unjustified level of control over society. The warning signs are right in front of us, because we've seen this happen in Russia already. Russia's media regulator has justified the country's censorship by claiming opposition media are perpetuating false information. The language of media literacy has been co-opted to enforce censorship. And now the same process is used in Western Europe as well, with the EU leadership justifying the ban on RT and Sputnik by accusing them of distortion of facts, information manipulation, and disinformation. Let us be clear, it is not the right of the government to tell us what is and is not a factual source, or to tell us we cannot watch certain news broadcasts or read certain news articles for several reasons. The first reason is a fairly obvious one. It's completely ridiculous to trust an organization like a government with regulating misinformation. A government cannot be a neutral arbiter on what is or is not misinformation, because every government has a vested interest in waging the information war in order to draw sympathy to its activities and maintain its influence. The conflict of interest is blatant. That applies to the Russian government, EU governments, every government. This is like trying to play a game of football with multiple referees who are all playing for the rival teams. The second reason is somewhat more nuanced. Even if an outlet is propagandistic, it still has value, as we can learn what people on the other side of the world are hearing. Denying ourselves the ability to analyze this is incredibly damaging for understanding complex issues like the Ukraine conflict. Because outlets like Russia Today clearly are propaganda outlets, essentially government mouthpieces, both because they have an instinctive bias towards the Russian perspective and because they are required to parrot state narratives by law, but that doesn't mean we should refuse to read anything these outlets are publishing. Like governments, search engine bosses are similarly being drawn into this conflict of interest as their leaders are allowing their political views to impact their service. And when you're responsible for deciding what billions of people around the world get to see, that's far too damaging to be acceptable. When dealing with propaganda and biased reporting, the solution is not to try and block it out, but to encourage audiences to read with a pinch of salt, or maybe a whole table of it. Healthy skepticism. This way we can both preserve free expression and fight misinformation, something the EU Commission claimed but failed to do with its regulations. Because trying to block out the other side is just not going to work. Restricting supply isn't the same as restricting demand, and if audiences still want to read these outlets, they can. Virtual private networks can easily be used to get around the website blocks of sites like RT and Sputnik, or even simpler, users can just paste the links for their web pages into the Wayback Machine and find archives of the whole sites to explore. These bans are only creating annoying inconveniences, not unscalable walls. So even if we set aside the fact that they're wrong on principle, they don't work in practice. This westward trend towards tougher internet regulation, represented by the EU's media block and various other legal moves, like the USA's Restrict Act, which intends to give the government the power to ban social media outlets from perceived enemies like China's TikTok with very little evidence of harm needed, or the UK's Online Safety Act, also known as the Censor's Charter, which among other things aims to police how social media sites moderate so-called legal but harmful material, are a kind of attempt to nationalize the internet, similar to Roskomnadzor's powers in Russia or the Great Firewall of China. However, you can't nationalize the internet because the internet is by its nature international. There will always be loopholes for these kinds of blocks. This kind of censorship can always be dodged, and these laws never actually erase the content they're meant to. The only way you could truly erase unwanted media or other content from the net would be to create a walled-off version of the internet, an intranet, like the system that exists in North Korea. And that's just impossible. Not just because no one in the Western world would want that level of regulation in their lives, but also because it would be a practical nightmare to implement. The impact of these laws is that they give governments a concerning amount of power without actually delivering results. It sounds contradictory to say this is both dangerous and also unworkable, but that's the reality. These kinds of laws also lead to another kind of blowback, the Streisand effect. It's inevitable that if you block a publication, there will be a subset of people that will go out of their way to dodge the block and seek it out specifically because you didn't want them to. The idea that an outlet is so concerning that the government wants to stop you reading it sparks curiosity. And curiosity sparks readership. What could they say that is so bad it has to be scrubbed from the internet? What is it that the government doesn't want me to know? This curiosity is something lots of outlets have exploited. In the West, many conservatives exploited the rhetoric of cancel culture to great success, promoting themselves as the figures the establishment don't want you to hear. Conspiracy theorist Alex Jones probably took this strategy to its greatest extent by literally calling his platform banned.video, even though it's a site you can freely access. It's the perception of being a suppressed outlet that counts, and this is something RT has exploited too. By making that censorship a real government policy, we're only ensuring that supporters of these outlets will be entrenched, believing that they were on the right track all along. And these people will be placed in an echo chamber as outlets like RT and Sputnik are pushed underground instead of brought into the light and scrutinized, creating less trust, less understanding, and more bias. We need to avoid a segregated echo chamber internet, where East and West are living in completely different worlds, blocked off from each other. And we in the West need to hear the other side of the story, because it's an observable fact that media in Western countries is not objective. Compare the reporting of outlets like BBC News on Ukraine from the first few years of the conflict to now, and you'll see a very clear difference.
During one recent news bulletin on BBC Radio 4, the correspondent referred to Putin's baseless claim that the Ukrainian state supports Nazis. This is itself disinformation. It is an observable fact which the BBC itself has previously reported on accurately and well, that the Ukrainian state has, since 2014, provided funding, weapons and other forms of support to extreme right-wing militias, including neo-Nazi ones. This is not a new or controversial observation.
In 2014, the BBC was condemning the denialism and whitewashing surrounding the far right in Ukraine, questioning why the Ukrainian public was not being informed about the issue. And now, since 2022, they are participating in that same denialism themselves, self-censoring for the very same reason they identified in the past, a fear of emboldening Russian propaganda. And it's not just the BBC. Other Western publications like Deutsche Welle and The Guardian have followed the same worrying pattern, rewriting Azov's neo-Nazi origins from an internationally acknowledged fact into a Russian accusation, and parroting the de-radicalization narrative. Even basic facts surrounding how the conflict unfolded have been rewritten, with descriptions of the Euromaidan referring to the events as a series of mass rallies or mainly peaceful protests, completely ignoring the paramilitary street wings of the Maidan self-defense groups, which scuppered the deal between Yanukovych and the opposition. Likewise, when the removal of Yanukovych by the Ukrainian parliament is mentioned, the details that this removal was unconstitutional or that over 100 of his party's MPs weren't able to take part in the vote because the building had been seized by the Maidan groups also go unmentioned. We see this revisionism and selective reporting because there is a perception in the West that we are, on some level, at war with Russia. And in wartime, the standards for truthfulness and objectivity are much lower. Propaganda and obscuring inconvenient details are seen as more socially acceptable to maintain morale. Before the 2022 invasion, topics like the constitutional questions surrounding Yanukovych, the leading presence of the far right in the Euromaidan, and their worrying influence in the aftermath, the pro-Russian attitudes held in some of Ukraine's east, Crimeans supporting Russian annexation, these were still talked about before without the need for hedging. Scrutiny and questioning, yes, but not hedging. Now any sort of narrative that could make the conflict seem less black and white is either not discussed or buried in hedging to undermine the seriousness of that narrative. That minimization of nuance is ironically the exact same approach followed by outlets like RT, focusing 90% of the story on the preferred side, and maybe 10% or so on the counter-narrative at the end, So it's absurd that we're banning Russian outlets for carrying out the same practices we do, just with the biases swapped the other way. And we have to be conscious of just how dangerous this mentality is, because we are not at war with Russia. The war is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Western countries may be indirect participants, but this isn't the same as the EU, UK, or US having boots on the ground shooting Russian soldiers or Russian bombs dropping on Western cities. We shouldn't just sleepwalk into the idea of suppressing freedom to protect freedom based on this wartime mentality, because we know what suppressing freedom to protect freedom looks like. It looks like the First Cold War. A war that ended with a Western world that compromised over and over again on the values it was supposed to be protecting, sponsoring dictators and anti-democratic groups across the world, and denying the public the ability to understand the damage that was being done until it was too late. Blocking one or two outlets like RT and Sputnik doesn't seem so extreme and damaging on the surface, but the mentality behind these bans can lead us down a dangerous road. A road that has us laying the groundwork for conflicts like the war on terror or the war in Ukraine without even realizing it. To be clear, these turns of events in the West, they are nowhere near as bad as what is happening in Russia. We could produce this documentary without being paranoid about forced foreign agent declarations, multi-year jail sentences, or being blacklisted by government AI programs. And that tells you all you need to know about which media environment is healthier. But that doesn't mean that these trends at home aren't a cause for concern. Blocking publications robs us of our ability to independently cross-reference the information we receive. Let's turn to our case study. What if the page of this Twitter user who posted their divided Ukraine map was blocked? There could be a case for doing so. The user proclaimed this map as the new map of Ukraine and called their proposed settlement the most realistic, least painful way to end the war. We could interpret this as misinformation and remove it. But in doing so, we would have no way of following the chain from the Quora post to the original source. And we would have no way of knowing whether or not the map really was from the Chinese state media. This could leave us with the impression that it really was a map from the Chinese state media, and by extension, the Chinese government, fooling us into buying a false narrative that China is seeking to divide Ukraine. In this example, we can see that using bans to supposedly stop misinformation can actually allow it to spread uncontested. This is the kind of slippery slope media censorship can take us down. Limiting our ability to independently analyze media increases the risk of falsehoods being spread. And blocking Russian outlets robs us of the ability to scrutinize their claims ourselves. So if we don't use bans, how do we defend ourselves from the tight grip of fake news? Grassroots education on media literacy. As we mentioned, there are good resources out there already, but we need to go further. Informational media literacy should become as widespread as possible, with the end goal of every user of the internet having an idea on how to spot misinformation, rather than only a select group of fact-checkers and researchers. A great example of something like this in action is Twitter's community notes system, where instead of unaccountable authority figures trying to hide misleading posts, community members can instead label them with extra context, with reliable labels appearing to all users based on ratings from the rest of the community, and an open source algorithm. Many of these notes are published all the time, and they're a much more trustworthy system for correcting the record than censorship. A system like this provides more information rather than less. With efforts like this, fighting misinformation can become commonplace in a healthy way, and that's going to be more and more important as time goes on, and the methods of misleading people get more sophisticated and widespread. There are major pitfalls on the internet that we all need to know how to navigate around, and educating people on them should be just as important as educating people about other risks like dodgy links and scammers. And to help avoid these pitfalls, we have some advice of our own we can offer. So it's clear what we're talking about here. Let's talk about some definitions. Sources and citations. When it comes to journalism, a source is a piece of evidence. If a reporter makes a claim, the source is what they base the report on. A citation is a reference to the source. Throughout our documentaries, you'll have seen that when we present sources, we provide links to them that you can type into your browser so you can read them yourself. We also include the links in our credits sections and in other areas. The links are citations, and the pages they lead to are the sources. With that in mind, there are 4 simple points you can remember when reading and watching the news. 1. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The more serious a claim is, the more evidence you should demand before accepting it, and the more you should scrutinize this evidence. Remember that sensationalism and shock value is often used as a tool, used to promote ideological messaging or simply to make a profit. The more controversial a topic is, the more likely you are to come across misleading interpretations of it. 2. Consider the motive of an outlet and what their bias might be. Some outlets might be motivated to mislead, either through outright lying or by failing to mention inconvenient details that don't match the worldview of their writers or owners. This applies both to mainstream media and alternative media. Mainstream and alternative outlets both try to build reputations of trustworthiness for themselves. The mainstream by pushing an image of trustworthiness and respectability, and the alternative by deconstructing that image, presenting themselves as a reliable alternative to the broken mainstream. In reality, no media organization is going to be perfect or spotless, whether they're staffed by career reporters or hobbyists. So don't focus on whether or not an outlet is from the mainstream or the alternative. Focus on what its people believe in. Be especially careful when looking at claims from governments and other figures claiming to be trustworthy authorities on information. What they say in public can often be very different to what they say in private. After all, authority figures are usually the ones with their jobs on the line if things are going wrong. Sometimes they will make genuine efforts to fix the problems, other times they'll try to find scapegoats or convince you that there's no problem at all. But don't take this one too far. Even if an outlet is biased, the substance of what they have to say comes first. If they have the evidence to back up their claims, it doesn't matter if their worldview is ass backwards. Proof is proof. 3. Follow a chain of sources. When providing sources to their claims, many outlets link to the publications where they found the source, rather than citing the source itself. To judge how reliable a source is, check through the publications cited until you can find the original source of a claim. It's much harder to scrutinize a source you only know of second, third, or fourth hand. 4. Seek out wider reading. It's important to remember that no one outlet can give you all the context possible on an issue. Outlets always have to make editorial choices to include less detail on some points and greater detail on others. So context can be lost even when a writer isn't trying to mislead or lie. That applies even to a long-form documentary series like this one. While we aim to give as much info as possible about the Ukraine conflict and its background, we can't include every detail of a conflict lasting over a decade. With context going back a century or more, in a few hours we have to make these editorial choices too. For example, the policy of sanctions imposed on the Russian population by Western countries, something we oppose and which we discussed in our Ukraine Narratives documentary, wasn't discussed in this Ukrainian Divide series, because we didn't feel we had more to add on the topic. We also haven't discussed the role of Belarus in the conflict, except for a brief mention of them hosting the Wagner Group. We didn't talk about the history of Ukraine and Russia from before the 1900s, or the issues surrounding other minorities in Ukraine, who are also impacted by the country's language laws, such as the Hungarians. And except for some specific case studies related to our media analysis, we didn't tackle the issue of war crimes and atrocities that have occurred in the conflict. To avoid this issue of missing context and get the biggest picture possible, See what multiple outlets might be saying about a topic, rather than getting your info only from the first publication you come across. You might find context that was previously missing. Services like Ground News can streamline this process, but an easy, free way to do this is simply look up a story online and check out others reporting on it. Following the news is a little bit like detective work. You have to build up a big picture of an issue by following leads. Some of these might come up empty, some might be red herrings, and others will get you closer to the truth. Let's take a small example to show why all of these points matter. This example is unrelated to the Ukraine conflict. It's just a story we happened to come across while writing the script.
Did you know that China has been equipping their soldiers with helmets that have a self-destruct button?
So here we have an interesting story. Apparently the Chinese military can force their own soldiers to self-destruct through a bomb in their helmet.
Let me repeat that. Chinese soldiers stationed in Tibet are being issued helmets that have self-destruct buttons. You press the button and a bomb that's embedded in the helmet goes off and kills the soldier.
Horrifying. But wait, a military killing its own soldiers with self-destruct bombs? That claim sounds extraordinary, doesn't it? Let's investigate. If we look up the person who reported this claim, Roman Balmakov, we can find pretty quickly that he's a reporter for the Epoch Times. So, what kind of outlet is the Epoch Times? Well, another quick search indicates that they are strongly opposed to the Communist Party of China, which runs the Chinese government, and by extension, the Chinese military. So there may be a bias problem here. But just because they're a biased outlet doesn't mean they're lying, so let's go a step further and follow the sources. If we look at Roman's video, he shows an article from the Epoch Times called "China Develops Helmets for Soldiers with Self-Destruct Button Report." Now we just have to follow the source chain to the end. The source in this Epoch Times article is an outlet called the China Observer. This seems to be the Chinese state media Roman was talking about. Helpfully, the Epoch Times provide an archived link to the China Observer article, and if we read it, it does make the same claims about weird sci-fi helmets that Roman and Epoch Times did. But there's a problem. The Observer says they got this info from observer.com, aka themselves. It's just something they've come up with without any evidence behind it. So we followed the chain to the end and ended up with no source to back up the story. Well, there's one last thing to do. Let's look up this story and see if anyone else is talking about it. Here we are. Here's another report on this topic from an outlet called Lead Stories. Called Fact Check: Chinese military self-destruct helmets for soldiers not reported by Chinese state media. Report source unclear. It dissects Roman's claims and reveals that Observer.com is actually an outlet from New York. It also provides an analysis of the story from another reporter. All I can say is that clicking through the Chinese language source articles cited by the Epoch Times does not appear to provide a clear statement that the self-destruct function on the gear being discussed would trigger a bomb or kill the service member wearing it. It could be read to imply that, but it could also imply mere breaking of the gear such that enemy forces could not access information or capabilities. Some Googling doesn't bring up obvious further sources, but rather repetitions of the same basic narrative, without further evidence. I would assess this as vague information from a minimally authoritative source. Now that we have followed our 4 steps, we can look at this claim in full. Did the Chinese state media claim that their country's military was mounting self-destruct bombs into the helmets of soldiers? No. We can see that none of the publications along the chain of the sources were from the Chinese state media. And when we get to the end of the chain, there's no evidence to back up the original claim about the bombs. So there we go. We found out that this story is at best unproven and at worst complete bullshit. Now what would have happened if we didn't follow the steps? If we never followed any of them, we might have just taken the story at face value and fallen prey to misinformation. If we only got up to step 2, we might have been skeptical, but we wouldn't have understood why the creators of the story would be motivated to mislead us. If we only got as far as step 3, we might have known that the reporter of the story was sketchy, but we still wouldn't know whether or not his claims had any evidence supporting them. And lastly, if we hadn't followed step 4, we wouldn't have gotten the big picture, which showed us that there was no supporting evidence to the story, and showed us how the story was misleading. So each of these 4 pointers are equally valuable, and they can each help you avoid falling for fake stories or getting lost in the whirlwind of narratives out there. And that's important, because if we let ourselves be influenced by distorted or false stories, our own worldviews could become distorted or based on falsehoods. The more understanding we have, the more positive our influence becomes. Another thing is that the appearance of such trash content, even staged content, should not be allowed to go unchecked, because it provokes the psychosocial disorder of those around us, and this leads to an even greater embitterment of the population and a new round of violence. Violence begets violence. The lynching footage, no matter which side, is aimed at destabilizing the psyche and provoking unsystematic violence. Shock media is nothing new, and this war is far from the only source of violent trash content. With social media, image boards, and websites specially made for the distribution of violent and distasteful media, warring factions now possess the tools to cultivate fear in order to control. Amateur propagandists can shock and most certainly mock to sadden or aggravate the viewer, and since shock content is mostly spread through closed communities of people, this kind of media has a profound mimetic effect, as observers may turn into consumers and distributors for entertainment. The entertainment derives from speculation. Maybe the victim deserved the violence, as they stole from the perpetrators, making the violent act an act of vigilantism. Maybe the victim themselves was a brutal warlord and they got a taste of their own medicine. Maybe a violent action happened through the breaking of an unwritten rule, making the victim complicit in the crimes of the tormentors in the eyes of the consumers. While all of these maybes may be, those are guesses, projections, or even fantasies. Most of the time, a happening depicted in a shock video is forever unresolved. The tormentors, just like the victims, are anonymous, and while we know for sure that something happened, it is almost impossible to attain the full context surrounding a piece of violent media. While videos depicting brutal events like industrial accidents, war crimes, and cartel violence may have different stories attached to the happenings, the purpose of this media is not to inform. It is to leave a lasting impression, leaving the viewer guessing just how painful the last moments of a victim's life must have been. It depicts violence that is beyond our imagination and acts as a great tool for propaganda. But that propaganda comes with a cost. Violence begets violence. But how does this relate to the war in Ukraine? Well, the fight for the integrity of Ukraine is able to be followed live, and the actors of this conflict want to leave a lasting impression too. Every minute updates flood an array of Telegram channels, many times depicting a recorded event that just happened. If the content is violent, that happening might be accompanied with messages of patriotism, sadistic mockery, and intense, dehumanizing hatred. With a never-ending stream of unverified, albeit dramatic information, following malicious content aggregators comes with an addictive quality. Now you can finally see what a war really looks like, courtesy of soldiers with GoPros or cameras strapped onto their uniforms. You do not have to imagine the unimaginable anymore. The answers are right there, on your phone or computer. The Ukraine narratives was partly designed to shock, showcasing the unjust violence being committed on the people who have no say in this war. We made sure to show the more tame material as opposed to the unnecessarily graphic, sometimes censoring the footage, even in our adults-only release of the report. We tried our best to remove the sadistic and voyeuristic aspect that may have been attached to the initial distributor's video uploads, and our use of this content certainly isn't for entertainment, rather for exercising media literacy. The odds are that most watch this kind of material for less benevolent purposes. Morbid curiosity is a powerful thing. What you see is not self-explanatory. Guesstimating what might have led to the recording of violence is far from helpful, and framing a depiction of violence as a battle between good and evil, where the ends justify the means, is inherently dehumanizing. The side you dislike the most, in this case, are monstrous genocidal fascists, giving you ample reason to see a people as less than human. Ukrainian people are mostly portrayed as pigs, and the Russians most certainly are at times depicted as subhuman too. A blatant attempt from amateur propagandists and trolls to piss off a viewer. Violence is also demoralizing. Not even too long ago, a soldier fighting on either side of a conflict was not able to view what was happening around them at all times, but now they have ample video and photo material at their disposal 24/7, being able to view gruesome acts of violence which may lead to intense feelings of anger and fear. The most prominent use of weaponized shock content in recent years must be the video productions originating from the so-called Islamic State. Making sure that a killing is recorded in the highest resolution possible and that good editing and dramatic videography are employed make for a great viewing experience for the sadistic shock content enthusiast and the terrified opponent dreading to come in contact with his monstrous foes. Through shock media, IS was able to greatly exaggerate their influence throughout the Middle East, portraying themselves as unbeatable and uncompromising crusaders, while in reality, many of their warriors got outgunned and harbored their own fears moving into battle. While in the case of the IS, shock content was produced by the terror organization itself, during the Russo-Ukrainian War, content is recorded by all sorts of people on every side. Sadistic soldiers and mercenaries filming themselves disrespecting their fallen opponents, civilians recording attacks happening to themselves, and even drone operators filming sexual encounters between members of the opposing forces before dropping a bomb, acting like a punchline to a joke. Most of this content is produced independent of the government structure. This does not mean that state media or independent propagandists don't use the existence of this kind of material for furthering their own messages. We want to remind you of a video we showcased on the Ukraine narratives, where a member of Ukraine's National Guard greases his bullets with pig fat. The video was uploaded by the National Guard themselves on Twitter, acting as demoralizing material for the Chechen Muslims involved in the conflict. Another example, the recording of a sexual encounter between two Russian soldiers from a drone above them. Two homosexual men engaging in a sexual act can most certainly be used to further a message of shame, weakness, and humiliation, especially for soldiers originating from a country that is more hostile or disapproving in disposition towards gay people, like Russia is. The bomb being dropped on the top of them, as described before, acts like the punchline to a joke. At this point, I want to reintroduce the quote from the beginning of the chapter. The lynching footage, no matter which side, is aimed at destabilizing the psyche and provoking unsystematic violence. This quote stems from a post from a news analyst channel known as Rybar, a pro-Russian Telegram channel. The post is an analysis surrounding a shock video of a prisoner of war being castrated. While the victim is squirming on the floor, an unknown man approaches him with a cutter knife, immediately getting to work operating on the man on the floor with many quickly placed cuts. Not much, if anything, is said during the castration. What, however, becomes obvious is that the sadists in front and behind of the camera show no hesitation or mercy in inflicting this torture. In a subsequent video, we are shown the victim of the lynching being put out of his misery, executed with a gunshot wound to the head. This video is a perfect case study on how the fog of war can cloud the information environment, and how quickly competing narratives can emerge. We identified 4 contrasting narratives surrounding this video. The first, that the video involves a Ukrainian prisoner of war, accused of being a rapist, being mutilated by Russian troops. The second, that the sides have been misread, the prisoner being Russian, and the torturers Ukrainian. The third, speculated by Rybar, that the whole video was a fake. And the fourth, that both the prisoner and the torturers were Ukrainians, with Ukrainian forces attacking one of their own in a kind of twisted act of retribution. Before moving on, we want to prepare you on what you are about to see and listen to. No graphic imagery will be shown uncensored. You won't hear the sounds of the encounter, nor will much moving imagery be shown. However, the description and breakdown of the crime will be discussed in detail in order to combat any allegations of forgery. The videos themselves will not be sourced in our source listing, but we will provide various links to articles which broke down the events within those videos and uncovered the identity of a perpetrator. If you decide to seek the videos out for yourself, that is of course up to you. So, what about this footage and the suspicions Rybar levied? Is the video staged, and how does Rybar's allegation of the lynching victim being a pedophile affect this case? This video made its rounds online, having been extensively covered since the original video was first uploaded on various Telegram channels. When watching the video, it becomes apparent that it is devoid of context. Someone is getting tortured, but we do not have any details within the video that would indicate that this person was mutilated for a specific crime, but both the victim and the executioner wear some kind of military uniform. But similar to the video we showcased in the Ukrainian narratives, in which the bodies of various soldiers were filmed on a street after some kind of attack, there was some debate over which faction was in what role in the castration video. All of these competing interpretations originated from pro-Russian sources. At first, the original source for the video, another pro-Russian telegram known as Grudz 200, posted the video seemingly celebrating this atrocity, as if it were a kind of retribution. But shortly after the video emerged, pro-Russian sources began to deny the alignment of the alleged perpetrators with their cause. A pro-Russian news agency known as Alt-Info reported the incidents, but claimed that the castration was conducted on a Russian prisoner of war instead of a Ukrainian one. At the same time, Rybar posted their analysis, questioning the reality of the entire event. The pro-Russia crowd seemingly couldn't decide if the event was real and an example of Ukrainian war crimes, or a staged incident of Russian war crimes made for psychological warfare. We analyzed the video ourselves and came to the conclusion that it isn't faked. Let us go over the reasons why we think the video couldn't possibly be fake. Fake chalk videos, just like regular TV productions, are scripted and casted. While in regular circumstances there is a wide pool of actors to choose from, like family, friends, or hired professionals, in an active war zone, the casting choices pretty much boil down to your own brothers in arms or cooperative civilian volunteers in the area. Remember, if a video is faked, none of the people in the video act genuinely, nor would they harm each other in order to produce a video. It also is unlikely that the actors from this small pool of people would be talented performers. While this isn't a requirement for faking a shock video, the amateur screenwriters of the video would likely have orchestrated the movie to portray the victim as unlikable or despicable. The victim was alleged to be a pedophile, but this detail does not become apparent in the video itself, as the victim, perpetrator, and bystanders do not converse. Instead, the video resembles a spontaneous recording, as if the group just decided to carry out this torture on a whim. There also was no introduction to the violence like we would see in many other execution videos which have been staged in a different sense. Having structure to the video, making demands or explaining what the alleged criminal has done to deserve what is coming to him. If a bunch of amateurs directed this fake shock video, we might have gotten something more sensationalistic and dramatic. Yet the video is direct and to the point in contrast. This is not a major factor, but something to keep in mind. How would people who have no experience in filmmaking direct their own home movie, even if it was shock media? Before the castration begins, the tied-up victim is treated like a rag doll. No considerations for a safety are in place. Soon after, another soldier curb stomps the victim. The boot makes direct contact with the head, and it was not a wimpy kick. During and after the castration, the vocalizations and squirming of the victim make it more and more apparent that the actions committed against him aren't acted for show. Violence is performed sincerely. A significant reason why Rybar alleged the torture to be fake is a lack of blood when the victim's genitals are cut into. There can be various reasons why we wouldn't see a fountain of blood, and it is also important to keep in mind that fictional media can give us wrong impressions on how a lynching like this one should look and sound like. There not being as much blood as we might expect can be explained in part through the anatomy of the male genitalia, the body's position on the ground, and finally, fabric surrounding the wound, soaking up the liquids and potentially obstructing the blood flow a little bit. Regarding anatomy, the castration begins by the perpetrator cutting into the scrotal sac, which mostly is made up of loose skin and does not contain any big veins or arteries, meaning no profuse bleeding can yet occur. Over time, the perpetrator cuts through the genitals more and more, eventually amputating the scrotum, and after tearing out more flesh and some more calculated cuts, the phallus too. The more you see of the castration, the bloodier it gets. The flesh is coated red and blood is visible. But why isn't a fountain of blood spurting out of the wound? The victim lays on his stomach, with his lower body slightly lifted for the torturer to conduct the castration. Blood flow is slightly inhibited by gravity, which is why it is often advised to hold one's hand above their head when they cut themselves in order to retard the bleeding. If one lets their arm hang down, more blood would gush out of the wound. One can also feel the blood pool in their head while doing a handstand, and the head would progressively turn more and more red. In short, gravity matters. If a victim was tied to a pole or would have been sat down onto a chair, we would have seen much more blood gushing from the wound, with more visible staining on the victim's clothing and potentially also more visible liquid pooling up somewhere. But the victim was lying on the floor with his lower body angled up and the wound pointing towards the ground, meaning that much of the bleeding was not visible to the camera, as the blood flowed into the inside of the victim's trousers, where it also was partially soaked up. If the blood seeped through the trousers and pooled below the victim, not much of it would have been visible, as the crime was committed on a dirt ground, which would have sucked up more blood. Rybar's observations regarding the surprisingly little amount of blood are interesting, but it would be foolish to label the video as fabricated based on that observation alone, especially because much of the wound and the area beneath was obscured by the lower body of the victim, which also occluded the light from reaching the ground and inside of his trousers. Now to the special effects. By implying that the mutilation shown on video is fake, it means that whoever produced the fake video used makeup specialists and prop makers to construct realistic-looking prop genitals which can be cut into and convincingly be pulled out and away from the body. How were the props constructed? What paints were available? Where to source the fake blood? Was a specialist for this job hired? And how were the prosthetics attached to the body so they could convincingly be cut and torn out without the viewer spotting inconsistencies like a drastic difference in skin tone or a generally under-detailed prop. The video still has a degraded video quality, but if a video was faked and acted, one key detail would be missing in the final movie. After the perpetrator fully amputates the victim's genitals, he picks them up, presents them to the camera, and throws them onto the ground, where they are clearly visible. If this was a faked video, the director would only decide to let the actor do this if the prop was immaculately designed. Realistically, the actor would be directed to briefly pick up the prop and throw it out of frame to minimize screen time as much as humanly possible. Instead, the flash is held up and presented and then thrown into frame with a person documenting the act following the body part with his phone camera. With all of these details considered, the castration video being faked is not only highly unlikely, it is an impossibility. After the dubious claims of fakery and Russian victimhood appeared, the last narrative attempting to explain away this crime emerged from a very strange source: the alleged perpetrator of atrocities himself. In an investigative effort by Bellingcat and a Russian publication known as The Insider, this alleged perpetrator was found, a man from the Tuvan Republic of Russia named Ochur Suge Mongush. He was alleged to be affiliated with a pro-Russian Akhmat battalion of Chechnya. Bellingcat's investigators reported that they had managed to contact Mongush by phone, where he admitted he had been in the area where the crime was committed, and gave an extremely bizarre explanation for the video. Mongush was quoted blaming Ukrainians for the attack on the prisoner, who was said to have been a fellow Ukrainian that had gone rogue and sexually assaulted a minor, and claiming that after this incident took place, the footage of it was somehow doctored and spliced together to make it appear like Mongush was involved. Mongush was also quoted by The Insider claiming he had never held a weapon before, and that he had reported himself to the FSB after the castration video emerged, with the FSB detaining him for 2 days and then exonerating after uncovering the apparent Ukrainian fake. This theory fails to answer an obvious question: how was Mongush doctored into the video? And if the FSB had discovered the fakery so quickly, why have they not published any evidence of it? This explanation meant to whitewash the crime instead makes it more believable, because the denial is paradoxical. Somehow this is a fake so good that it is seemingly undetectable to the average viewer, and unexplainable by the victim of the fake, but also crude enough that according to the story, it could be detected after a very short investigation by the FSB. The absurdity of this contradiction throws this video edit theory straight out the window. Combining these baffling justifications with the cross-referencing of various photo and video material from a castration video, execution video, and images of Mongush from news broadcasts and social media, The Insider and Bellingcat became certain he was the perpetrator, showcasing photo comparisons and the similarities they spotted across videos. Certain key details remain consistent: the wide-brimmed sheriff's hat, decorated with a seashell pattern loop, black bracelets around his wrist, and the same shirt he wore during the crime. Bellingcat's part in the investigation focused more on geolocation. In their article, they refrained from showing Mongush's face, as it never was clearly visible in the lynching footage. By comparing visual landmarks in various video and photo material, like cracks on the ground, uniquely shaped trees, and vehicles on the scene, together with Mongush's testimony, Bellingcat was eventually able to triangulate the location of the crime scene, being the Privilya Sanatorium in Luhansk. As a result of this analysis, with location, crime, and perpetrator all researched, this is an incident under investigation for war crimes. All of these details aside, what Rybar and other outlets continuously point to is the victim being an alleged pedophile. Few people are as hated as child molesters are, which is convenient to keep in mind when a story does not benefit your cause. If the viewer can be convinced that a brutal killing was conducted against a person who would even harm children, maybe the viewer could give the benefit of the doubt, or even treat the killer as the hero of the story. Despite almost all of these outlets rejecting responsibility for the crime on their side, they are simultaneously trying to justify it as some ugly form of vigilante justice, even though no evidence is presented of a victim's alleged sex crimes. This reeks of denialism. We didn't do it, but if we did, it was deserved. Each of these elements that Rybar attached to this analysis of shock content mainly served to deflect away any culpability from Russian forces committing atrocities. And it is disappointing to see publication with such a strong message, warning that viewing ultra-violent media harbors a psychological cost, having an overwhelmingly negative influence on social interaction and the mental health of entire groups of people, could combine that message with unsourced accusations. Rybar claimed that Ukrainians had a habit of defending pedophiles in chat boards, for example. They then followed up on this rhetoric by using it to brand Ukraine a worthless nation. Yet we see no sources for this claim whatsoever provided. No examples of such messages. Not a link. A screenshot. Nothing. While condemning dehumanizing shock content, this outlet created their own as a strange form of coping mechanism, and they seem to either not realize or just not care. This highlights one of the most dangerous issues regarding information warfare and analytical reporting. Those who are responsible for creating a healthier information climate and fighting misinformation can instead be the ones that poison this climate and spread that misinformation. This is a trap we almost fell into ourselves. In earlier drafts of this video, we presented Rybar's post as an excellent analysis on the damage shock content can do, and we didn't question their claims because we were distracted by that positive message. Thankfully, we had a chance to re-examine this topic with due diligence. These instances of information warfare resemble the strategies of movements like the 9/11 conspiracy theorists. When they don't have proof for their theories, they will instead follow a two-step strategy. First, ask enough compelling questions to sow doubt in the conventional narrative. Second, bombard the viewer with counter-narratives. The idea is that by creating this doubt, the conspiracy theorists can do something called shifting the burden of proof. Instead of them having to prove the conventional narrative is false, you now have to prove that it's true. And if you can't, you have to accept one of their counter-narratives instead. Even though these counter-narratives don't provide credible evidence, they don't need to, because the questioning will have undermined your confidence. Step 1 complements Step 2. Nothing in this strategy relies on hard facts, only speculation. Now, this isn't to say that someone asking questions is usually a warning sign. In fact, the opposite is the case. Asking questions and poking holes in narratives that might not add up is always good. But if this questioning is used to then sell you on counter-narratives that aren't backed up by facts, that's when our alarm bells start ringing. To counter this kind of strategy, we have to point to one of our media analysis tips. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Conspiracy theories which provide speculation instead of evidence are just that. Theories, not facts. That doesn't mean they should be dismissed without looking into them. Conspiracy theory is often used as a dismissive term to refer to narratives that are unpopular, but the truth isn't a popularity contest. It doesn't matter whether the claims come from a fringe outlet or a mainstream one. You should use the same standard of proof. Question everything is a good line of thinking. Question everything except conspiracy theories is not. So when we look at these theories, if there's no clear facts involved, we have to go off of probability, the logic of Occam's razor. The theory that requires the least assumptions is the most likely one. So let's think about the Mongush case in this way. To believe the castration video is a Russian war crime, we simply have to assume that Russian troops are able to commit war crimes and that some of them are willing to do so. We also have to assume that someone from these forces would be willing to publish the video or to send it to someone that would. To believe these other stories, we have to assume that the Ukrainians are willing and able to commit doctored war crimes. Then we also have to assume that for some reason they would single out Mongush, closely recreate his distinctive outfit, including his cowboy hat and bracelets, either through dressing someone who looks very similar to him up with copycat fashion, or through sophisticated video editing. And if we want to follow the video edit theory, we also have to assume that the FSB has uncovered some really solid evidence for this war crime being faked, solid enough to release a suspected war criminal after only 2 days of investigation. And that they have a good faith reason for not publishing it, even though exposing the Ukrainians for faking a crime like this would be absolutely golden propaganda material for Russia. As we can see, these pro-Russian narratives require much more of a mental workout to believe in this case, and there are a lot more questions we have to avoid asking to keep them believable. Questions like, what actually is a good faith reason the FSB would keep their evidence of this fake hidden, if they really have it? If the Ukrainians really are faking war crimes in this elaborate way, surely it's in the public interest for everyone to know about it? And why did the Ukrainians choose to fake a war crime like this when there will likely be some real war crimes which they could point to without the risk of being exposed for their lies? Without answers to these sorts of questions or facts and evidence to prove the speculations, conspiracy theories like these aren't credible. But while we have instances of false negatives like the Mongush case, where claims of fakery are made without proof, we also have instances of false positives, where claims of a video being real footage from the front lines don't hold up to scrutiny. Here's an example of one. Early into 2023, March specifically, a video emerged on Russian Telegram accounts seemingly showing Ukrainian troops committing a war crime. The video is a dashcam clip showing the view from a car. A Muslim family is shown being caught in a traffic stop by soldiers who appear to be from the Ukrainian military, with a giant iron cross and Ukrainian flag displayed on their vehicle. After the troops find out that the family are Russian speakers, they quickly become aggressive, and when they move to leave the area, they shoot at the car several times.
Успокойся. Что происходит? Что они творят?
Ти мразота, правила дорожнього руху знаєш?
Не розговаривайте со мною.
Ти колону бачила? Ти людей моїх бачила, техніку? Хлопця мого, якого ти ледве не збила?
Да, я никого не сбивала.
Мразота, документи свої давай.
Подождите, пожалуйста.
Швидше, швидше!
Пожалуйста, сейчас. Возьмите.
Так, слухай мене. Мустафаєва Аїда Сапферовна.
Да.
Ще раз.
Да.
Я побачу тебе на цій дорозі.
Да, это...
Ще раз, сволота. Ти будеш на рух. Слухай мене, бля. По-перше, розмовляй зі мною державною мовою, свиня. Свиня, свинячою мовою зі мною не розмовляй. Ти що, тупа? Я не подивлюся. Я зараз не подивлюся на дитину.
Не разговаривайте, пожалуйста, не нужно ничего.
Ты тупа?
Нет, я не тупая, не нужно. Что вы делаете? Что вы делаете? У меня ребенок маленький в машине, что вы себе позволяете? Кошмар! Солнышко, иди сюда. Успокойся. Тихо, 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 успокойся, пожалуйста. Просто кошмар! Не делать мне, что вы творите? В шоке. Тихо, успокойся, тихо. У меня ребенок маленький, что вы творите? Это ужасно!
clip was quickly circulated around the pro-Russian outlets, including media organizations, other Telegram accounts, and even the Russian government's UK embassy, and was used to amplify pro-Russian narratives of a Ukraine infested by Nazi ideology. As with the Mongush case, Bellingcat investigated the incident, but rather than supporting the claims, they disputed them, claiming that the video was a fake. Unlike the counter-narratives in the Mongush case, Bellingcat provided very credible evidence for their allegations, supported by various pieces of information. They noted that the footage had been geolocated by an outlet called GeoConfirmed, and that this outlet had revealed that the footage was over 30 kilometers deep into Russian-controlled territory at the time it was apparently filmed. They also noted that the use of dashcam footage in Ukrainian-controlled territory was highly unlikely, as dashcams had been banned in Ukraine ever since the early months of the invasion, back in 2022. And Bellingcat's case was evidently correct, because even staunchly pro-Russian outlets ended up admitting that the video was a hoax. Rybar, for example, which initially used the footage to push their rhetoric that Ukraine and Russia can't peacefully exist, and Ukrainian statehood should be destroyed, later attached a correction admitting the video was faked. However, the Russian embassy kept their post up even after it was exposed, but thankfully a community note was added to correct the record. What should the takeaway be from these two examples? Well, whenever you see a politicized or extreme claim, try not to make assumptions. Look at each allegation case by case, and search for a context that either supports or discredits the footage. In scenarios like military conflicts, where every basic detail has become a flashpoint in the info war, we cannot afford to give ground. Do not take footage for granted. Do not accept accusations blindly. No matter how reliable an aggregator may be, you should always look for the sourcing that backs their information up. This is why we work hard to rigorously source our work. We do not want to be taken at face value. We want our work to be trusted for one reason, and one reason only. We have the research to back it up.
So, here we are. We've just about reached the end of our series on this conflict. We've covered the history, the narratives, the context surrounding the neo-Nazis and far-right extremists. But before we close out, there's something you still probably want to know. How does this war actually end? First, let's talk about the situation on the ground. In our first episode, we explained that there had been several key points where major territorial gains were made. Russia's initial invasion, then Ukraine's Kiev and Kharkiv counteroffensives, all in 2022, but that for 2023, the war had been stagnant, with the conflict devolving into brutal attritional warfare. In 2024, that trend has continued. In the last months of the year, Russia has been on the offensive, pushing ahead in Donbass and retaking small pockets of Kharkiv, but their progress has been extremely slow and costly. To try and stall this advance, the Ukrainians launched an offensive into Russia in August, crossing the border into Russia's Kursk region and occupying a small pocket of territory there. The idea behind this was to use the occupied territory as leverage in future negotiations and force the Kremlin to divert forces away from their offensives into Ukraine. This turned out to be counterproductive for the Ukrainians, as Russia chose not to prioritize retaking Kursk. An offensive that was meant to tie down Russia instead tied down Ukraine, leaving large numbers of Ukrainian troops that could have been taking part in the defense of their country stuck holding a small scrap of Russian land they had no intention of holding in the long term. Although the offensive had some propaganda value, showing that Russia's borders were unstable and that the war in Ukraine was making the country less secure, not more, it was ultimately a strategic disaster. With the continuing stalemate on the front lines, the focus for resolving the war has moved to the diplomatic front. To Russia, peace means Ukraine recognizing the Russian annexation of the 5 disputed regions, Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson and Donbass, and agreeing to military neutrality. To Ukraine, peace means regaining all of those regions and joining NATO. When they each talk about peace, they talk about completely opposing ideas of peace that the other would never accept. As we mentioned in episode 1's conclusion, both Russia and Ukraine were holding firm, hoping for a curveball event that could break the deadlock and turn things towards their favour. The Russians were hoping for Western commitment to break, cutting the lifeline of foreign military aid that keeps Ukraine's war machine going. The Ukrainians were hoping for another Prigozhin moment, where Russian internal discontent could collapse the Kremlin from inside. After nearly 3 years of the invasion and 11 years of the Russo-Ukrainian war in total, we have our curveball, the US election. In that election, US President Joe Biden dropped out as a candidate after a disastrous debate performance and fears around his age impacting his ability to do the job, and his replacement, Vice President Kamala Harris, failed in her attempt to keep the Democratic Party in power. Donald Trump is now President-elect of the United States. Biden and Harris were committed to opposing Russia. Trump is not. He has a reputation for softness surrounding Russia and has openly said he would have allowed Russia to take Ukrainian territory in exchange for a peace deal. His party, the Republican Party, have frequently criticised what they call blank checks being written to Ukraine. Although the Ukrainians have never gotten as much as they wanted, the overall trend over the past few years is that they've been able to pressure Western countries into giving more and more aid, pushing the boundaries on what weapons and equipment can be sent and cutting the strings attached to using them. Under Trump, that trend won't just stop, it will rapidly reverse. Trump's ambition is to be a decisive peacemaker, and we have an idea of what his peace looks like: a frozen conflict. The war stops along the present battle lines and the remainder of Ukraine stays neutral, at least in military terms, so no NATO membership. It's a settlement much closer to Russia's ambitions than Ukraine's. In order to convince the Ukrainians to accept it, Trump's government plans to use US military aid as leverage. That aid makes up almost all of the military support Ukraine has been receiving from the West. Without that aid, Ukraine will struggle to find the capacity to carry out offensives or even maintain many of their current lines. It's the aid that keeps their military on a level competitive with Russia's. So while they might not face an immediate rout, especially since the Biden administration is trying to buy time by sending huge quantities of aid and loosening the rules on how it can be used before they hand power over to Trump, the Ukrainian leadership will have to very quickly face up to a stark choice: a peace involving major concessions or a slow collapse. Given that Zelensky has already begun publicly referencing the prospect of giving up Ukraine's lost territories, a rapid shift from his long-held position that nothing will be bargained for, last referenced only a few months ago, it seems he's already reckoned with his choice. Some have tried to avoid this fork in the road by suggesting that the rest of the Western alliance could pick up where the US leaves off, but this idea doesn't survive contact with reality. Although most of Europe's leadership has maintained their sympathy for Ukraine, they haven't prepared for the prospect of having to shoulder her burden alone, without the intense might of the US military-industrial complex on their side. That means Europe's ability to pick up the tab and deprive Trump of his leverage is minimal at best, non-existent at worst. Expecting European nations to suddenly, rapidly increase aid by around 3/4 is no small feat. It would involve massive tax rises, cuts to spending elsewhere, or both, at a time when many are already struggling with the cost of living. That's a much less intense struggle than living in fear of occupation, artillery, or a missile landing on your house, but that kind of adversity in pursuit of a very faraway victory would be hard for voters to stomach. But more importantly, even if it could be funded, Europe doesn't have the kind of military-industrial complex that the US has. Most of the US aid money has gone into its own domestic military industry, paying local companies to produce weapons and equipment that are then shipped to the Ukrainian front lines. Western European nations like the UK and those in the EU don't have the same capacity to do this. Zelensky's hopes of achieving his maximalist aims relied on long-term support. Ukraine could have potentially won the game of attrition against Russia had the West been willing to support it for a decade or two. Maybe, just like Afghanistan in the 1980s, Russia could have been bled dry over time, its morale drained, and eventually made to withdraw. But with the change in Washington, the door to that outcome has closed. The exact specifics of any deal are still up in the air. Trump is known to be highly erratic when it comes to foreign policy. In his first term, one moment he was threatening to send North Korea into fire and fury, the next he was shaking hands with Kim Jong-un and promising to bring the North out of its isolation. In Syria, one moment he was aiding the Kurds, and the next he was selling them out to the Turks. Trump's wildcard nature means the details of what happens next are still very open to debate, but what is clear is that the incoming US leadership will be softer on Russia and harder on Ukraine. The consequences of this are likely to be seismic. A frozen conflict involving perpetual Russian occupation, especially of territories that are in every sense, culturally, linguistically, Ukrainian, is a peace without justice. Ukraine being forced to accept it through starvation or gunpoint is a recipe for long-term resentment. That kind of resentment can be a major threat to creating a lasting peace. In the short term, Zelensky ending the war with many of Ukraine's lost territories unrecovered could shatter his Churchillian war hero image and leave him open to claims of betrayal, especially from ultra-nationalist figures. Long-term rivals of the state from volunteer battalion figures like Right Sector and the Azov movement, putting the stability of Ukraine at risk. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin will feel emboldened. Although he's had to shrink his ambitions, it's Putin who has won the battle of attrition. The Second Cold War has only just begun, and with the US having a non-committal president, not just non-committal towards the conflict in Ukraine, but in a much broader sense, towards even NATO itself, the West may have already lost, the Western Bloc deprived of its strongest power. And it seems that some don't realise the damage this would bring. We've mentioned previously that a lot of so-called anti-war commentators have essentially encouraged appeasement to Russia, claiming this is what will bring a better world. They believe that a Russian power bloc would be a positive, as a strong counterweight to the US and the West. And let's be honest, we can understand why. In the last 2 decades, the era of the terror war, Western interventionism has done immense damage, showing the world that Western influence isn't such a rosy thing. The US has been far from a model country, and its influence as the world's superpower has been very destructive. It's a country that has constantly preached about freedom, democracy and human rights, while making those values into a laughingstock through its actions, illegally stalking people through mass surveillance programs at home and abroad, sanctioning countries into starvation, waging aggressive wars and forming alliances with governments just as authoritarian as its enemies. The list of injustices is long, and other NATO members have been participants in them one way or another as well, and many people are tired of it. So there's a certain appeal that comes with the idea of Russia being a strong power, able to say no to the bullies in Washington. But we have to ask ourselves, has Moscow shown us a better example for the world? Watching the war in Ukraine in real time over these past years has given us some insight, and the answer is no. This isn't like the First Cold War, which saw a struggle between 2 very differing visions for the future. This is a struggle between 2 sides of the same coin. Russia's leaders don't really represent an alternative to the American way anymore. If anything, they've emulated it, creating a crony capitalist country, waging aggressive foreign wars based on lies, distortions and victim mentalities, and using creative terminology to deny the reality of their actions. Just as the USA's conflicts were renamed to avoid the legal need to seek a declaration of war from Congress, with the Korean War becoming the UN police action, or the invasion of Iraq becoming Operation Iraqi Freedom. The Russians have renamed their conflicts to dodge their own laws against aggressive wars. The Russo-Georgian War became a peace coercion operation. The war in Donbass became an inter-Ukrainian conflict. And now the invasion of Ukraine becomes a special military operation. The Putin vision of the 2020s doesn't look much different from the Bush vision of the 2000s, a vision of imperialism, undeclared wars, and delusional saviour narratives. And so, the results of that vision should be the same: failure. The Russians being a counterweight to the US is useless if they rely on the same tactics, the same suppression of independence, and the same empire-building desires. The hypocrisy of activists who claim to be anti-war and anti-imperialist while excusing Russia's militarism are just as damaging as the hypocrisy of Western politicians who lecture on freedom and democracy while supporting dictatorships in the Gulf. Essentially, the Second Cold War is one the Western Bloc deserves to lose, but the Eastern Bloc doesn't deserve to win. I say this because I'm speaking from experience. Growing up in the era of the so-called War on Terror, I saw Western governments fueling extremism in Syria while telling blatant lies that they were only supporting moderate Democrats. I learnt how they'd done the same thing in Afghanistan, and how that had led to the birth of the groups that carried out the 9/11 attacks. I learnt about so many instances of Cold War meddling and tyranny carried out by the US and its allies. The never-ending attempts at regime change, Vietnam, Nicaragua, Chile, Congo, Cuba, Iran, and so on. I learnt how they invaded Iraq on the basis of blatant lies about supposed WMDs that didn't exist, and that fueled a contrarianism in me that made me overlook the dirty sides of the political West's enemies. I was thinking of those lies when we were told Russia was imminently going to invade Ukraine. I laughed when the media announced dates the invasion was supposedly going to happen on, and they passed by with nothing happening. Another fear-mongering grift to manufacture hostility towards Russia. They aren't imperialists like the Yanks. Putin's too savvy to do something so thuggish. And then he did it, giving a speech riddled with what I see as the world's greatest sin: hypocrisy. He cited all those instances of American lies and aggression, and then told his own lies and laid the groundwork for his own aggression. He told the world he would respect the sovereignty of the post-Soviet states. He told the world he had no plans to occupy Ukrainian territory or impose anything by force. He told the world he was forced to act to protect people from genocide. He told the world freedom was his guide and he wanted Ukrainians to have a free choice. These things were all lies. The genocide was made up, and so was the respect. He held referendums at gunpoint and swallowed large chunks of Ukraine. There was no free choice to be found. Putin's speech called the US an empire of lies, and he was correct. But the speech and the actions that followed it revealed the truth. He was that empire's perfect mirror. These scumbags were made for each other. I couldn't stay blind anymore. There was one perfect word for this: imperialism. And that's why when we wrote about Ukraine the first time around for the Narratives Project, we decided to call out self-proclaimed anti-imperialists and anti-war activists who were embracing hypocrisy when it came to Russian warmongering, and why we repeated that call in this series too. A genuine multipolar world where everyone gets their fair share and a seat at the table would undoubtedly be a massive improvement over current things. But that's not what Russia's offering. The modern Russian doctrine is a step backwards, a return to the power blocks of old, and a return to imperialism, where smaller nations become client states, secondary to the wants of larger powers. If you trade US imperialism for Russian imperialism, what you get is imperialism. It might be different people suffering from different borders and different wars with different countries at the top of the hierarchy, but it's the same mechanisms with the same results. All of that is being conveniently overlooked or ignored by certain sects of the anti-war crowd in the name of peace. And well, it's true that accepting the bulk of concessions Russia demands will bring a kind of peace. But the problem with a peace without justice, a frozen conflict, is that you don't resolve any of the underlying issues. The issues generating so much rage and hate. A frozen conflict can easily thaw. Syria has shown that very clearly. 13 years of war, 4 of a mostly frozen conflict. Suddenly, in just a week, it reignited, rapidly escalated, and totally changed the situation on the ground, answering some questions and asking new ones. That's not to say we think that justice is bloodletting attrition until Russia is defeated by conquest. We don't think conquerors make true solutions in this day and age. We said back in the Ukraine narratives that we don't think the people of Donbass should be forced to rejoin Ukraine if they don't want to. But the truth is, we don't know what they want, because they've never had a real choice. Russia's supposed referendums, first in Crimea, then in Donbass, Kherson and Zaporizhia, were all obvious frauds held under duress. To us, a peace with justice would involve serious referendums, real choices. As we said before, it's an unfortunate truth that within the post-Soviet borders, there are large numbers of people that aren't happy with the countries they are expected to call home. We don't think the right answer to that is rigidly sticking to those borders, and we don't think redrawing the map at gunpoint is the right answer either. In the battle of values between sovereignty and self-determination, we believe self-determination should win, and the third option, conquest, should be kicked back to the Dark Ages where it belongs. States shouldn't be prisons with millions of their citizens rattling on their cages. They should be reflections of their populations, as best as possible. And before anyone asks how much land of my country I'd be willing to bargain away to Russia, the common response to suggestions that these territorial disputes should be resolved in some other way than by force, I'll give you the honest answer: none. But that's because my country doesn't have a substantial pro-Russian minority that wants separation. I'll tell you just how much of my country I'd be willing to give up to separatism in general, as much as the people of its regions want. In the UK, we clung to the argument of sovereignty for centuries, refusing to give up land for so long, but since the 1990s, we've had a fundamental shift. We found a peace with Irish nationalists in Northern Ireland by agreeing that its status would be up to a referendum if the time ever came that the nationalists were in the majority. We eventually responded to Scottish nationalists in the same way, holding an independence referendum in 2014 where Scots narrowly voted to stay in the Union. It's not a principle we've perfectly upheld. It has been tested, as the Scottish nationalists call for another referendum that we've so far denied them, but it's the practice of a value I've come to hold closely, that nations only deserve to exist by consent. In most cases, I don't want to endorse separatism. I don't think that countries splintering into endlessly smaller and smaller pieces, drawing more and more borders, is a recipe for prosperity in the world. But I also believe that it isn't up to me to decide. For now though, these values have no chance to come into play. These disputed lands will be dealt away under political and military necessity, with little the people living in them can do about it. Ultimately, whose victory really is this? Well, no one's, and everyone's. The Russians have expanded their territory and outlasted their enemies, but this territory is only something like 20% of Ukraine, containing less than 10% of its population. They failed in their ultimate goal of bringing Ukraine back into Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and in the process they've alienated the entire Western world and encouraged remilitarization. Even if the war ends, that hostility could last for decades. And all this is at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Russians killed or wounded. The obsession with the front lines in Ukraine has also left Russia vulnerable elsewhere too. Since the invasion, the Ukrainians have dabbled in their own proxy war games to weaken their archenemy, first in Mali and Sudan, gutting Russian contractors and their allies, and most recently in Syria, where they allegedly helped train the Syrian rebels who launched a lightning offensive that collapsed the government of Bashar al-Assad in just 10 days, a government which Russia had been working to prop up for 9 years. With so many Russian troops scraping at Donetsk, Kharkiv and other corners of Ukraine, when Assad dialed for help, he wasn't backed up with soldiers. All he got was a one-way ticket to Moscow, a humiliation worthy of the rapid defeat of the US-backed forces in Afghanistan 4 years earlier, or South Vietnam's Saigon in the 1970s. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have preserved their independence under intense pressure, but they've lost even more land than the 7% lost in the Donbass war, and they've failed to achieve that true westward pivot they hoped for. While their newfound allies talked a big game and were able to be continually pushed on the boundaries of aid for several years, the biggest requests, like a NATO-enforced no-fly zone, closing the skies, always received a resolute no. The West was not willing to risk a world war over Ukraine like the British did over Poland in World War II. Large sects of the Western world, and the entire world, saw an outpouring of sympathy for Ukraine, but that sympathy didn't go as far as a willingness to go to war for Ukrainians. They tested their limits, and they didn't budge. Most of the West has had peace at home for a very long time, and is unwilling to give it up, especially when we're conscious that a miscalculation, going a step too far, could start and end a war very quickly with casualty numbers the likes of which the world has never seen, scorching the world into a wasteland. Putin's nuclear threat went nowhere when it came to his supposed red lines surrounding weapons deliveries, but when it comes to the idea of a direct NATO-Russia conflict, there, Western leaders and populations are much more cautious of the risks. The Western world has blunted the Kremlin's war goals in its own backyard without having to go on the war footing itself. The Kremlin had to draft hundreds of thousands of its own citizens and orient its purse towards the conflict to persevere with its own slimmed down ambitions, while the average Western citizen didn't even have to get up off the sofa. But ultimately, the West's big brother wasn't in it for the long game, and that could create a long-lasting fracture that could upend a geopolitical balance that has lasted ever since the end of the Second World War. The consequences of this trade are yet to be seen, with the US becoming a wild card untied to the Western bloc, a bloc it leads and created. The rest of the West will have to think about what to do now that its big brother is leaving the family. Right now, at least publicly, world leaders are trying to pretend nothing is amiss. The UK Foreign Secretary, who once called Trump a deluded tyrant, a neo-Nazi sympathiser, and someone who was no friend of Britain, is now calling him a gracious host and talking about common interests. But behind the scenes, European leaders have been considering the possibility of going it alone. Back in February, the then German finance minister talked about British and French weapons forming the pillar of Europe's nuclear umbrella, rather than America's. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, said in a recent summit, "We must not delegate forever our security to America. The world is made up of herbivores and carnivores. If we decide to remain herbivores, then the carnivores will win and we will be a market for them." There is a clear recognition that 80 years of the US taking the lead in the West are about to come to an end. All the talk about a special relationship of shared interests and values was a mirage, and the fog is starting to clear. Sadly, this is happening too late to ensure a better future for Ukraine. For Ukrainians, the aftermath of this conflict will be key. When the bombs stop falling, the issues that have been set aside will be reopened. how to address the remainders of the volunteer battalions, those which are still very much politicised and hold a dubious level of loyalty to the state, how to form a healthy sense of nationalism and differentiate this from the normalisation of toxic nationalism, rooted in the whitewashing of figures like Stepan Bandera, how to reconcile the divisions resurfaced since 2013, where Maidan and anti-Maidan activists found themselves on opposite sides of the barricades. There will also be new questions to tackle too. How to reckon with the prospects of an uncomfortable peace and who to manage it. The terms of Zelensky's presidency and Ukraine's parliament have both expired, but elections have been prevented by martial law. When the time comes to release the country from those conditions, the debates will truly begin over his legacy and who should follow it. He gambled on marching westward, and that gamble has failed. Despite public statements, he was given a lukewarm reception. No rapid integration into the EU or to NATO. Support with arms but not troops, and a boatload of hesitancy, reservations and skepticism. Russia controlling 20% of Ukraine is better than 50 or 100%, and Zelensky's refusal to yield in the early days of the war likely saved it from reaching those kinds of numbers. But the raw truth is that hundreds of thousands have died, millions have been wounded or traumatized, cities, towns and villages turned to rubble, in a war that has made Ukraine smaller. What lessons will be learned from that? Will Ukrainians feel betrayed by the West as a whole, or will they lay blame purely on the US? Will they still try to integrate with the Western world so their sacrifices weren't in vain, or will they stake a claim of their own? Will they try to restore some sense of peacetime normality, or will they remain on a war footing indefinitely, wary of the failure of past peace agreements to hold, and dreaming of reuniting with the lost of Donbass, Zaporizhia, Kherson and Crimea? Ukrainians have gone through many intense tests to achieve recognition and cohesion, and it may be that the greatest of those tests is yet to come. The path to peace can sometimes be a greater challenge than surviving in wartime. I hope the Ukrainians survive and thrive throughout these tests, and that they maintain the recognition they deserve. The fact that there are separatists and those who would rather be Russian in these disputed lands does not change the fact that the Ukrainian people, culture and language exist. Ukraine is not Little Russia or New Russia, nor should it be. It is Ukraine. And for Russia's people, we can only hope that they too can survive the upcoming tests to their nation. They will also have to reckon with this war and ask themselves if it was worth it for their people to be sacrificed in their hundreds of thousands for the sake of calming Vladimir Putin's anxiety. Will they identify with that anxiety too and feel he's saved them in the nick of time? Or will they scream at how much they've been expected to suffer for a pathetic lunge of imperialism? With Russia ending this war larger than before and having seen off its archenemies in Washington, the first option is more likely, but there will still be many who aren't true believers. Will those more independently minded Russians try to fight for a place in their homeland, or will they continue the exodus that so many have already gone through? We can only hope that in the long term, Russia's people come to disavow the war that has been perpetuated in their name, and form a new blueprint for their nation, with a nationalism based on celebrating the great culture they hold dear, rather than attempts to reform the empires and power blocks of old. Russia should be an influential and valued country, one which can act as a counterweight to other powers and help prevent a new monopolization over the world. But this can't be based on pure power. There has to be some real substance to things beyond vague appeals to a nationalism that relies on subjugating others. The end goal of this counterweight can't take the form of a bipolar world like the past century. Bipolarity isn't a solid foundation for a new world order. It's a mental illness. The Eastern European family is a dysfunctional one for certain, badly in need of some serious therapy. The wounds can be mended, not just by time, but by people, well-meaning people. These changes are yet to come, but history moves fast these days. We'll be following it, and hopefully you will too. For now, we just want to say thank you for sticking with us throughout this series. Thank you for giving us your support, and thank you for watching Mega.